Here.
Senator Rothman.
Here.
Senator Wasserberger.
Here.
Representative Freeman.
Here.
Speaker Harshman.
Here.
Representative Larson.
Here.
Representative Summers.
Here.
Vice Chairman Landon.
Here.
Chairman Mildred.
Here.
You have perfect attendance today.
Fantastic, thank you. As we get started, remind everyone to shut off their phones or put them on silent so that we aren't interrupted by phones. And then also, as you're speaking today, please make sure you identify yourselves as we are being broadcast. So hopefully you all look good on TV. Mr. Vice Chairman, do you have any opening comments?
No, Mr. Chairman, just I think everybody has interacted with this committee before. We just ask that you address the chair and adhere to decorum. We don't want to fight to break out or anything like that, so we're ready to go.
Very good.
Yeah.
So with that, the next order of business is the adoption of our June 10th, 2019 meeting minutes. Are there any additions or corrections? Is there a motion first, I should say?
Move adoption of minutes. Second.
Been moved and seconded. Are there any additions or corrections? Hearing none and seeing none. Is everyone ready to vote? No disagreement. All those in favor of the minutes, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. The minutes will pass as circulated. With that, we'll move on to our first item of substantial business, and that is the educational suitability of school buildings and facilities. Councilor Hewitt, as well as state construction school facilities, will give us a rundown of this topic, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So at the last committee meeting, I think the committee had a really robust discussion about the School Facility Commission's responsibilities in prioritizing school facility needs. And there were a couple bill drafts that came out of that discussion. And one of them carves out major maintenance money for educational suitability and reworks the prioritization process. And the other increases major maintenance funding and also carves out major maintenance funding for educational suitability. So I'll take the first bill first, and that's 20 LSO 113, Working Draft .4. It's titled School Buildings and Facilities Suitability Needs. And I'll start on page 3 of the bill. And first off, I apologize. I took this chance to make a few statutory changes that I consider really cleanup. And so on page 3, you'll see that the bill opens up 2115-109, which is the major maintenance section. And it goes into the definition of major building and facility repair and replacement. This definition was changed by 2018 House Bill 32. And there were several uses of the word upgrade in that bill, some of which were enacted into law and some of which were not. And so the changes at the bottom of page 3 and the top of page 4 removed the what I consider to be residual uses of the word upgrade. The AG's office has opined on the effect of the language of upgrade in here, and the AG has opined it doesn't really mean anything, so taking out the word upgrades really just kind of cleans up the statute.
Representative Larson.
Are we ready for questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. So, Ted, thank you, because the question that I had as I read that is upgrade means an updated version. Replacement often does not. So if they had to replace a system, for example, an HVAC system that was antiquated and you couldn't get a replacement, does this allow them to replace with an upgraded system?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, thanks for the question. So later on in the bill, there's a new subsection in the major maintenance statute that allows school districts to use a percentage of major maintenance money for educational suitability needs, which would allow the addition of new components, new systems. So if a school didn't have a air conditioning system, that subsection would allow it. This this definition of major building and facility repair and replacement, the changes here have no effect upon, or should have no effect upon, the law here. The current definition of major building and facility repair and replacement allows school districts to, replace existing systems, so long as it's consistent with their originally intended use. That's not affected by these changes.
Follow up? Representative
Mr.
Larson?
Chairman, if I may, just to make sure I'm clear, so they could replace, again, let's just go with an HVAC system that may be antiquated and needs to be replaced, can't be replaced with a similar one, has to be replaced with an upgraded version, as long as it's for the intended use, then that's acceptable. Am I understanding that correctly?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, correct. Yeah, that more efficient system that does the same thing, that's allowed under current law, and that would be allowed even with these changes. So yes, yeah.
Further questions? Please proceed. Mr. Hewitt?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, on to page 6. This is another statutory cleanup provision. Subsection F deals with the 10% of major maintenance money that can be used to maintain enhancements. And this subsection has several uses of the passive voice, which make things a bit ambiguous. There's some longer sentences in there that could be broken up. And so the changes within subsection F, the intent isn't really to change any, the meaning of this. It's really just to clean it up, make it a bit more clear, and really improve the readability of it. Mr. Chairman, then on page 8, we get to the request of the committee, and this is the first of the committee's request, and that is to allow school districts to use up to 20% of their major maintenance money on educational suitability needs. And the way this is structured is it would allow school districts to add or components or systems for the purposes of improving educational suitability. There are a few limitations on this, starting on line 13 on page 8. Expenditures under this subsection shall not be used for
Low on a wall. And as a matter of fact, we want all the districts now to design their schools so that it's easier to do those types of things. If you want to have a minor revision to a school, increase the capacity without having to go for a remedy. What about additional language that's more similar to what you just said, outside of the design criteria of the building, or something along those lines, to allow for circumstances where a small increase in square footage may be appropriate while not entirely restructuring the school? I mean, we don't want giant increases without school facilities coming into play, but is there language that's compromised that allows for the opportunity where if I end up increasing my square footage by 100, life goes on? Have you thought about that? Maybe we can ask the department when they come up and check.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, Senator Ruffus, I don't have specific language in mind that would accomplish that. Certainly, minor increases in square footage are allowed when using major maintenance money. I think there's a limit of, 150 square foot increase, something like that. So it's allowed in the major maintenance realm. Perhaps we could structure something so that something similar could be allowed for this.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Bebout?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm still having trouble wrapping my hands around this suitability. And as I read this, I understand the shall not be, but then it says that shall be made only after the department has approved it. Yeah, we're taking 20% to say it shall be for suitability, so I just don't see how that's gonna work. I mean, it's such a broad word, and this definition says what it shall not be. I don't see where it says what it really shall be, so I'm assuming you're gonna say by rulemaking, we'll see that. And then once we pass this, go through the rulemaking process, obviously we can comment on it, but it's out of our hands. And I just can't get around this suitability.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Bebout, you're absolutely right. There is no definition of educational suitability in this bill. And there'll be a presentation by the State Construction Department a little bit later on this morning where they'll discuss possible definitions. So you could put a definition of educational suitability in here. You could require the commission to define it by rule. You could tie it to educational suitability standards that are otherwise required by this bill. There are different ways you could go with it. But as of right now, in this subsection, it's not specifically defined. So I think it's a good point on your part to bring that up.
And Mr. Chairman, the other thing is, when you look at all the lawsuits and everything, particularly about how we look at major maintenance component, is there anything in there that talks about suitability? Is it mentioned anywhere in any of the cases? We shall provide the best education and all that. I guess that means suitable.
Yeah.
But how does that fit into all of that?
So, Mr. Chairman, Senator Bebout, in the Campbell 2 decision, the Supreme Court, in looking at the status of school buildings in the state, did look at an evaluation by a consultant of school buildings about their educational suitability. And the court, as part of that decision, required the state to bring buildings up to a level of educational suitability. I think the requirement for the legislature is to ensure that the state funds school districts so that they can have adequate school buildings that are capable of delivering the educational basket. So I mean, does that answer your question?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, one last thing, and then we'll listen to what the department says, but what I think suitability means and what you think suitability means probably could be very different. And that's the problem I have in that interpretation, so we'll see where it goes. But right now it's too broad, it's up to, everybody's gonna have their own ideas, quite frankly. And I don't see where the Supreme Court, they say the best and all that, I don't see where the suitability comes in. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Ted, maybe you or Matt can send the email that you all sent to me to everybody on the committee earlier, because it kind of talks about these issues and it has the actual language. And Mr. Chairman, it just says the court then ordered the following. We order all facilities must ultimately be safe and efficient. The goal for providing facilities which are safe and efficient is to attain a score of 90 or above for building condition, and an education suitability score and technological readiness score of 80 or above, blah, blah, blah. So it goes on and says that, but I think what ultimately is not clear is how we define education, basically suitability, education suitability. And so in statute, I think it's also important to note in statute, that we define up-to-date standards for air quality, illumination, and appropriateness of student environment is really what education suitability is defined as, I think. Is that correct, Ted?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, you're absolutely right that language is tied to educational suitability in that prioritization statute, that when the commission is coming up with a score for buildings, they're supposed to include metrics of educational suitability. And those metrics have to look at illumination, air quality, appropriateness of the student environment. So yes, the legislature has tied those items within the concept of educational suitability.
So follow up again.
Follow up, Representative Summers.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. So, theoretically, one way of at least taking a crack at this is if we're not comfortable, or if we like, we leave it alone. But if we're not comfortable with those three items, we can change those three items. The legislature, because that would in fact change what the definition of education is. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Yes, yeah, you could change them. That would impact how the School Facilities Commission prioritizes building needs as it relates to educational suitability.
Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ted, on the tail end of the last two comments, when we get over to that air quality illumination technology and appropriateness for student environment, even in this the survey that we had, it doesn't really give the criteria of what that means. What does air quality mean? I mean, when we talk about air quality, what are the standards that we're basing that on? What are the standards for illumination? And so I think going back to this whole conversation, Mr. Chairman, I would sure like to see some, I think we need a little definition, or I'd appreciate some definition so that I would know how, if I was the Department of Construction and I was making that score, I would have some parameters there that I knew how to make those scores.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do think we need to be a little bit careful, though, with what goes in statute versus what goes in rule and regulation, so that we allow for some of those standards to evolve over time. And we want to make sure that we're setting appropriate high-level policy and having a narrow enough scope that it can't be abused. But the department, with the scores that we've been working with over the last decade plus, has gone down into fine granularity of exactly what amounts to what score. We use industry best practices. We hire consultants that do that. So I think we might need a little more detail here, but I'd be averse to substantially more detail on what we're going to characterize it as and ensure that there's flexibility for the department working with stakeholders to adopt a rule set and then potentially evolve that rule set over time. So I guess I just urge some caution. When it comes down to educational suitability, we've had conversations in this select committee over the years of things like this. There's no mechanism, if this is a schoolroom in a building, there's no funding source to put a wall down the middle so you can have two classrooms. You can't do that. And that's really what we're trying to simply get at here is a school district should be able to use its major maintenance funds when they look at this room and they see this is not educationally suitable. We could have two classrooms in it. Boom, they put an application into the department says yes, that's covered by statute. So I hope we won't kind of risk the utility of this by being too prescriptive on where we go with it. And I would urge caution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And so if that email does get sent out, one thing that was the email sent to me, it does also have the appendix that is in rule with suitability, as the current rules for suitability are in that. But, I guess, and I know we're supposed to be just asking questions, so at the end I'll have to figure out what my question is, but my comment back to the good senator is that if we don't constrain this in statute, I think this turns into a boondoggle. And we need to be able to, unless we got a really good funding source for this, we need to be able to constrain it to what's reasonable. And I think that's going to be our challenge. I think we absolutely have to do it. But what is reasonable and what is not reasonable, and how do we work on defining that, and what is the definition for that? What should be in statute and what should be in rule? And I think that's really the crux of the biscuit. Wouldn't you agree, Ted? Thank you.
Vice Chairman Landon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking at the agenda this morning and really appreciate the comments of the committee. And Ted, thank you. This really is where the crux of the issue is. I mean, what is suitability, and how are we going to define it, and where are we going to define it? I thought perhaps that should rest with the commission, but I don't think it should, committee. I think this is where we've got to try to decide what we're going to do with it. Coming up after a review of these two bills, we're going to get a presentation from the department, and I think that's going to be really helpful. And then, Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure what your plan is, but I think we can come back and work these bills it's a little hard to work them right now without the presentation to follow, I think. And so that's just a sort of a process statement, committee, but we can certainly discuss as we go here, but I think it's going to be really helpful to listen to the department.
Senator Beefack.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one last question about that, and I get what Senator Ross has said, but under the definition of major maintenance, and it goes way back to the importance of it and how critical it is. To me, deciding later on that we should have had a wall is something we should have decided early on, and it's not really major maintenance when you've got those different things. So is there any legal precedent? If there isn't, I agree with Senator Landon said, let's listen to the department, but I think that's something that should not be covered by major maintenance. To decide that maybe you should have 3 of these sections blocked off or something. I don't think that's major maintenance.
Thank you. Representative Freeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think suitability is a word that can be abused, but efficiency, I think, is the other word that I heard just a minute ago, is very efficient. This committee has heard the description of the last classroom that I worked in that only had 4 outlets. It didn't have any outside air coming in. And when you have 15 students that just come in from PE without a shower, that becomes very interesting very quickly. But suitability, I think, is a word that we have to tackle at some point. When my classroom was built, they didn't have anything like document cameras. They didn't have any computers that needed to be charged. It wasn't suitable for me, and that was 8 years ago. And I don't know. Another example that I've used is that we had one of those movable walls, and that was great when it was designed for a foreign language classroom so that they could put the 2 classes together. But when they put the social studies department in there, and you could hear everything that was happening in the other room, there was no way that our maintenance could do that without major maintenance. You have problems, because then you're competing against roofs, you're competing against other problems that you have. So suitability is a word that can be abused, but it's also a word that has to be tackled in order to have quality instructional space. And with that, I would like to understand, for my own benefit, maintenance of local enhancements, which is on page 8, line 14. So if you have a local community that puts together a pool, then all of a sudden it has to have a new pump for chlorine and stuff, is that being denied in this language?
Go ahead, Mr. Hewitt.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Freeman, yeah, that would not be covered under subsection G. That would be covered under subsection F, which allows school districts to use 10% of their major maintenance money to maintain enhancements.
Thank you.
Thanks for the good questions, committee. I'd remind you, this bill addresses how to pay for suitability if we use the current suitability definitions. If we want to have a separate bill that change, delete, add to suitability, we can do that in a separate bill, but let's let Mr. Hewitt get through what this bill does, because this bill was never designed to change what suitability is. This is just how to pay for those suitability items based on existing statute and rules. So we'll proceed, and then we can have a discussion later if we want something more in terms of suitability changes to the definition. Ted, go ahead, or Mr. Hewitt, right?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. All right, so I think as was mentioned, the department would have to approve expenditures made for, or the department would have to approve expenditures made to address suitability needs made under this subsection. There are requirements put on school districts. They would have to report amounts expended. school districts could accumulate year to year unexpended major maintenance monies up to 20% of amount they receive in any given year. And so they could, in theory, build up a big amount to address some big educational suitability need. But the accumulation couldn't exceed 20% of their major maintenance money per year. And if a school district exceeds its expenditure limitations under the subsection, then the department in the next year would have to reduce their major maintenance payment by that excess expenditure amount. Any other questions on the major maintenance?
Vice Chairman Landon.
So Ted, what that means is, it seems like that's pretty open-ended. There's no language here that prohibits a district from just accumulating from this point forward ad infinitum, right?
Yep, that's correct.
That's simply on paper. There's no requirement in statute that they set that aside in a special account or anything like that. Can you clarify that?
Yeah.
In other words, I can save my 20% from now on and accumulate as much as I want.
Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman Lander, you're absolutely correct. There's no maximum amount that can be accumulated. There's no cap on that. School districts do have to separately account for the money, so they would have to keep track of it, and there would be a yearly limit on the amount they could accumulate, but they could accumulate year over year ad infinitum.
Thank you, Ted.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On that point, just sort of the mechanism or the logistics of it, you can already accumulate major maintenance from year to year, and theoretically, I think this is similar to the language for accumulating for enhancements. The 10%, is that accurate or not? Can you accumulate those 10%?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, you can accumulate the 10% for maintenance of enhancements. There is language in that subsection that provides that school districts have to address the needs within their school facility plans first.
Right. Just going to follow up. I guess the concern would be a circumstance where I would be setting aside 20% for several years, and then my roof would fail. So I've got 5 years of 20% that I've set aside with some future vision. There needs to be some fungibility, and I think it's silent on that, but just if I need that 20% to go back to a demanding major maintenance crisis, I should have the ability to do that. I don't know whether this says I can or can't or what the situation is, but I think we should be clear that it should be fungible back out of the fund so that I can use it for another major maintenance crisis, a more traditional one.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, you're right, it is silent on that point. If the committee wants to direct one way or the other, we can certainly do that.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions? Please proceed, Mr. Hewitt.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. All right, so that addresses the major maintenance request of the committee. Next, we get into the request of the committee to rework the prioritization process. And the basic request of the committee was to segregate the prioritization of condition needs, capacity needs, and educational suitability needs. And so if we're going to have distinct prioritizations for each of those needs, then we need to make clear that the commission is setting adequacy standards for educational suitability. We need to make sure that the commission and the department are assessing buildings based on those standards. And so that's what the next couple changes in the bill do. So on page 10, on lines 7 through 9, there's an addition. This is within the requirement that the commission set adequacy standards for school buildings. So the uniform standards shall at minimum include, and one of the requirements is guidelines for adequacy and functionality. And I've replaced functionality with educational suitability. This is the only use of the term functionality in these statutes. And the commission has interpreted it basically to be educational suitability. But I thought it'd be good to be explicit that when the commission is setting adequacy standards, that they set guidelines for educational suitability. And then moving down page 10, we get into subsection B, which governs the department's responsibilities to assess buildings based on those adequacy standards. And at the bottom of page 10, there's a sentence to read, the assessment shall be designed and maintained to provide timely and uniform statewide data on all of the following. And there's a list, and one of the items in that list is student educational and safety requirements. And I've added including educational and suitability requirements, just to make clear that the assessment that the department does assesses educational suitability requirements. So, Mr. Chairman, then on to page 12, this is where we get into the statute that governs the prioritization. And as I said, the basic request was to segregate out prioritization of condition needs, capacity needs, and educational suitability needs. And so what I've done in this section is rework the A intro a bit and require the commission to annually develop a series of prioritization schedules. And those schedules are laid out in paragraphs 1, 3, 6, and 7. 1 is the condition list, 3 is the capacity list, and 6 is the educational suitability list. And I've lumped together technology readiness and educational suitability into that last one. And then paragraph 7, because the commission needs to come up with a budget recommendation every year, they're going to have to figure out, okay, what is the number one priority? We're going to fund that. So the commission under paragraph 7 would have to create one consolidated list based on the criticalness of the needs. So they would take the most critical needs from the 3 lists and then work down from there. So to go through the list one by one, on page 13, that paragraph 1, starting on line 13, requires the commission to annually develop one schedule to remedy building condition needs, which shall be based on appropriate criteria and measures for building condition as established by commission rule and regulation. You'll see that on lines 15 through 19, I've taken out that educational suitability and technology readiness language. That's moved to the to paragraph 6, which talks about the educational suitability prioritization.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With paragraph 7 on page 15, Roman 7, talking about coming up with a criticality list. One thing that we did when this is a little different hat, but over on the Minerals Committee when we did all of the remediation of sites, we included criticality as the most important factor, but it wasn't the only factor because cost efficiencies could be dramatic if you do 2 projects at once. If you pick number 7 and number 13 on the list and do them at the same time, you save $500,000. Readiness of the project was another factor that we included. So I think criticality needs to be the most important factor, but I think we should look to the language that we used in a couple of pieces of remediation legislation over in the Minerals Committee to ensure that there's some flexibility to do what's also most cost effective in carrying these out. And we might want to amend that language a little bit when we work the bill later. And I don't know if, ask Ted if you had any discussions about that or if you've given any thought to providing a little bit of flexibility there.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, it's an excellent point. I would note that this is coming up with a remediation schedule of needs. The subsequent subsections, B and C, talk about coming up with, which specific remedy are we going to do? And that talks about the commission and the department come up with the most cost-effective remedy. So there, I think that, those subsections would inform, the cost, impacts of these things and help the commission decide which projects they're going to pursue.
Quick follow-up, Mr. Chairman. So what you're saying there then is that the creation of this list in Romanet 7 does not necessarily lock them into that order for addressing those needs. It just sets a criticality preference, and then the budgeting process and other processes would do that. Is that the thought?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ruffett, that's my thought. I mean, some needs that are really high, don't necessitate a big, outlay by the state. And so I think there is flexibility in the commission's process of creating the budget recommendation out of this list.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I do think that's something that we should be specific and explicit about at some point. It doesn't necessarily have to be here, but call out the fact that the department needs to look at that list and then be sensitive to timing and cost efficacy as part of the consideration, not just the criticality, because I think there will be an expectation that if I'm number 7 on the list, I need to be done before number 8 on the list.
Yeah.
And that isn't always going to be the case. And we know from history and school facilities that if it isn't the case, we'll hear about it. So we might want to be explicit.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, Senator Ruffett, I think that's the case with the current system. You got the set list, and it's not always done in order.
Yeah, thank you.
Further questions? Mr. Hewitt, please proceed.
All right, thanks. Mr. Chairman, okay, on to page 14, we have the schedule for capacity needs. This is largely taken from current law, which governs how capacity needs are assessed. Down at the bottom, page 14, the schedule for technology readiness and educational suitability needs is addressed. This would be for buildings and facilities used to deliver the educational program. The schedule, on to page 15, the schedule shall be based on appropriate criteria and measures established by commission, rule, and reg, which include the air quality, illumination, appropriateness of student environment issues. And then in the middle of page 15, we get into that paragraph 7, which talks about the consolidated list. And as we discussed, it's based on the criticality of the need. Mr. Chairman, going back a bit on page 13, up at the top, I'll just point out that current law provides that needs that impede school districts' ability to deliver the educational program should be prioritized. I've kept that requirement. That starts on line 1 on page 13. It says, under each of these schedules, the commission shall prioritize educational building and facility needs that impede the delivery of the prescribed educational program. And then, Mr. Chairman, the other request made by the committee was to have some sort of component process to bring educational suitability needs to the fore. And my impression is that the commission will, under this is written, the commission will be developing a list of educational suitability needs, and they'll be coming up with recommendations for how to address those things. In some cases, that's going to be sort of a component style remediation. And so I think that having the commission set standards for educational suitability, having an assessment of school buildings against those standards, having this prioritization process for these needs, I think you're going to get those component style recommendations regarding educational suitability. If the committee wants a more detailed process that specifically addresses projects within a certain dollar range, we can do that. But I think that this basically covers the concept of the request as it comes to the component style project. And then, Mr. Chairman, finally, I'll point you to page 18. This is the repealer section. There are a couple provisions repealed within the prioritization section. And these are concepts that are moved into other portions of the prioritization section. So as I discussed, the priority given to issues that impede the delivery of the statewide educational program, that's brought up into the A intro. And then there's a provision which talks about the commission coming up with a methodology and process for identifying the most critical building and facility needs. That's built into that consolidated list paragraph.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Roth.
Thank you. Ted, going back to the discussion about how do we integrate components, which is obviously something we struggle with, I don't think I understood how you said it would be remedied, and what we've struggled with is you have this component process where you have to apply for component funding through the budget as a separate line item, whereas major maintenance is more of a sure thing, you've already got it budgeted for. So even though something might be a great component project, if you can afford to put it under major maintenance, you end up doing that because of the timeliness and the way the budget process works. You have some districts that use components and are the bulk of where our component funding has gone over the last decade. We have other districts that haven't spent a dime practically of component funding over that same time. So there's an inequity there. And what I'm curious about is how this would in any way remedy that, because it doesn't really seem to go directly at this problem we've had where certain larger districts are capable of absorbing things in a way that the component works for them. They have enough staff to apply for the component. Other districts just don't, and I think we've done a bad job of components over the years. So how would this help to address that problem that we've been looking at?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, I think it addresses that by clearly identifying what the needs are. And the list of educational suitability needs is going to be created by the commission. It's going to come before this committee. It's going to be all the lists would be presented to this committee. And so you would see that list of needs, and I think that by seeing the list of needs, you have the opportunity, the commission has the opportunity, the committee has the opportunity to address those needs. Also, the component process that currently is used by the commission and the department isn't anywhere in statute. And there's nothing that prevents that in current statute. And so if the department and the commission wanted to move forward with a similar educational suitability component process, similarly they could, do that under the current law. So I don't think there's anything preventing it. And I also think that you will be getting a lot more information about these educational suitability needs, so that they can be more readily identified and addressed.
Follow-up, Senator?
No.
Anybody else? Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So, Ted, I'm sorry, and I know you said it and I just missed it. So in the repealer on Romanet 4, where in the bill is Romanet 4 placed? Because obviously that's like the critical piece.
Yeah, Romanet 4 is placed on page 13, the middle of line 1 through the middle of line 4. That requires the schedules, the 4 schedules, to prioritize educational building and facility needs that impede the delivery of the prescribed statewide educational program.
Yep, I see it again. I know I saw it.
Follow-up, Representative?
Mr. Chairman, that's good, thank you.
Anything else, committee? Ted, just as kind of an alert to the department, I think structurally I'm following the bill, and I commend you for that. I think part of what we talked about before committee, just as a reminder, is to try to set up a system where we can parcel out educational suitability sorts of things, because just by their very nature, I don't think they're ever under the current system going to rise to the top. You just simply aren't going to get a paint project or a moving a wall to come out ahead of the needs for an HVAC system or a new roof. So I think, and I'm looking at you, Ted, correct me if I'm right here, but I think structurally that's going to allow for the development of a list. But I'm going to be interested in what the department how that would play out on the ground and what that would look like if we asked the commission to parcel something like that out. So anyway, that's a little bit of a warning, I guess. But Ted, any thoughts on that? I think that was your charge, was it not? To try to figure out how we could develop a little bit of a separate look at what would be educational suitability.
That was the charge, and I think that, you know, I've expressed my thoughts about, you know, how the bill works to accomplish that, and if the committee wants to put the current condition component process in statute, we can do that. We can create a similar process for educational suitability.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Please proceed. Oh, excuse me, Representative Freeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So what I would consider like routine maintenance, like painting of the hall, replacing carpets after 10 years, is there a difference between routine maintenance and major maintenance, or are they the same thing?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Freeman, they are distinct processes. Yeah, routine maintenance is, you know, oiling various, you know, items that need to be oiled, you know, cleaning buildings that need to be cleaned. Major maintenance is, you know, repairing and replacing significant components of a building, a boiler, roof, that sort of thing.
Okay, Mr. Hewitt, please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. On to the next bill, 20 LSO 114. This is the bill that increases funding for major maintenance and then carves out a portion of major maintenance funding for educational suitability. So on page 3, you'll see changes to paragraphs C, 6, and 7 within 2115-109. And these are the multipliers within the major maintenance formula. Multipliers for educational buildings and multipliers for office and warehouse buildings. And these, in part, determine how much major maintenance funding is provided to the school districts. So current law has the multipliers at 2%. There was a bill last year that would have increased them to 2.5% in the 22-23 school year. This bill increases those multipliers to 2.75% because the committee requested that we increase them up to the 2.5%, but then provide some additional bump to provide for educational suitability needs. So I've just picked that 0.25%. The committee can change that as it desires. Also, the school year I've left from the bill at last session, the 22-23 school year. The way that the bill carves out major maintenance funding for educational suitability needs is the exact same way that it did in the previous bill. So on page 7, you'll see the subsection G. That's recreated here, same as in the last bill, except that the percentage that can go to educational suitability needs is not specified, because once the committee figures out how much of the major maintenance money, you know, you'd like to see go to educational suitability needs, we can fill that in. That will depend partially on where you set the multipliers and how much of the multiplier, you know, you want to send to be used for educational suitability needs. So that percentage in subsection G is left blank. I've also included the changes to subsection F, which I made in the last bill, which clarify language a bit.
Mr. Chairman?
Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ted, just a question. I mean, you know, so just offhand, you picked a number for education suitability. Could we actually in statute say we shall not expend more than a certain percentage on education suitability? In other words, if we're gonna, not only are we limiting
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, I'm not sure I'm completely following the train of thought, because the way subsection G is structured, there is a maximum amount. There's a percentage of major maintenance money that can be used on educational suitability, some percent per year.
Mr. Chairman, follow up.
Although I've tried again.
So, Mr. Chairman, sorry.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
So I thought 20%, district can use up to 20%, Mr. Chairman. It does not limit, so every district could use 20%, but 20% of their entire major maintenance piece.
Right.
But what I'm saying is, could we statewide limit the pot of money
Oh,
on suitability? And then that is the limit. So we don't use any more than X amount of money on this suitability issue statewide.
so Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, so for example, you would like to see something possibly say that the maximum amount spent under subsection G, for example, shall not exceed $20 million in a given year, something like that?
Yep.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, you could do something like that. I'm not sure of all the collateral consequences to doing that. I'd have to think about that further.
Mr. Chairman, or I am the chairman. As I answer your question, Robert, I think you put yourself in conflict, because every district would already be allowed to spend up to 20%. And then if you cap that pot of money statewide, and certain districts didn't get theirs spent or wanted to, but didn't get the pot quick enough, they'd be in conflict with the existing statute saying they could spend that. So I recognize where you're trying to go with that line of thinking, but I just don't think, I think we would end up putting ourselves in conflict.
Mr. Chairman.
Follow.
So follow up, Mr. Chairman, I agree, but, the alternative is you could make it a component funding only and not a percentage of major maintenance. That suitability is only component funding, and you could you could create a pot of money that is just that, and then basically limit that, and then the commission would have to spend no more than that on component funding for suitability. Could we do something like that?
Well, Ted ponders
Yeah.
that. I think you could. That's a different approach than setting aside a percentage. That's just
Yes.
saying we're going to address suitability based on component level, type of prioritization. And here's how much money will be appropriated annually. Or the legislature shall determine annually how much to appropriate. But yeah, totally different approach than what we're going, but that would be a better way to do it if that's what the desire was, than trying to set aside a set amount of money out of the existing 20% and doing it that way. Senator Ross.
Ted, my question is about kind of the overlap between the first two bills. The language in F and G is similar to, but not identical to, what we're putting in 113. So if we were moving both of them forward, obviously you wouldn't want both language sets for F and G. So I'll just ask quickly, on 114, if we completely severed F and G, the rest of the bill stands alone correct? As raising from 2% to 2.75%.
Yes.
So there's nothing needed from F or G otherwise,
No.
correct? Thank you.
Further questions on LSO 114? Okay. Senator Wasco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. I'm looking at the bottom of page 5, and at the bottom of page 5 it says, any district expends funds within a separate account for purposes not authorized by this section or by rule and regulation of the commission. The payments for that district shall be reduced by the amount of the unauthorized expenditure in the school year. My question is that new language or is that existing language? And if it's existing language, has any school district been punished for doing it?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Wasserberger, that is existing language. and I do not know the answer to your second question. But I imagine the department would.
Senator will get the department to answer the second half of your question here momentarily. Further questions? Mr. Hewitt, thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
You're
Chairman.
going far, so we'll have more questions for you soon. Director McOmie and Mr. Fetty, would you like to offer some of the department side on thoughts? And then committee will go back and work on these bills, but that way we'll have a little bit more information in terms of how the department will handle implementing these bills and addressing the operational side of it and some of that. Director, before you get started with your presentation, if you would answer the one question from Senator Wasserman as to districts that have overexpended one year, have they been penalized the next year? Has it occurred?
Yeah.
Now, if you'd start your presentation with that and get into everything else, that'd be great.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Del McOmie, I'm the Director for the State Construction Department. And I have with me today Mr. Bill Small with FEA Facility Engineering Associates, one of their vice presidents, I guess? President. And as you probably recall, Mr. Small and his firm have done a lot of work for the agency on building assessment and condition reviews for us over the years. And so one of the tasks that we were asked to do was to talk about the impacts by this bill and the major maintenance. So before I get into that, so I asked Bill to obviously weigh in on that discussion. So before we get started into that, yes, we have had some districts that have overspent, but we have not taken money away per se. Within the dollars that they have coming the next year, then that is reduced because they only have X amount of dollars, but we don't penalize them, take away dollars from that they overspent. We just look at it as a checkbook as a whole, and so at the end of the day, where are they at? So.
Senator Wasserberger, does that answer your question? Okay, thank you, Director. Please proceed.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get into that, I do want to recognize we have 3 commissioners here today. So I want to introduce Chairman Garland and Vice Chair Gilmore and Commissioner Anderson. So thank them for their travels to come down and certainly listen to this, since there's a lot of discussion on what the commission shall and shall not do. I appreciate them being here. It's better they hear it firsthand than me trying to make the elephant have pink polka dots when I'm explaining it to them in a commission meeting a month later. So thank you. As far as the changes in these 2 bills, I guess first as an editorial comment, certainly we, the department, the commission, I feel can work within whatever legislation is done under those 2 bills. Don't really see anything that isn't workable, or in fact that we aren't already doing to some degree. The concern that I have, and this will be borne out, I think, in Mr. Small's presentation, and the question really from the committee is, what's the impact to the major maintenance program? And so the first bill that was discussed, where you use the 2% and then you carve off an additional 20%, keeping in mind that we already carve off a 10% for safety and another 10% for enhancements. And then given the fact that a couple of years ago we did a study for this committee that really indicated that within the 2% of those major maintenance dollars that were hitting the building, there's really only 1.6% of that 2%. Now, not a multiplier of, but 1.6% when you use that multiplier factor. Other dollars are going for site improvements and things like that, so they aren't necessarily touching the building. And so when we look at that, my concern is that carving out that 20% out of that amount really is going to have an impact, and again, it's pretty dramatic, and you'll be able to see that in the presentation, on the life expectancy of the current buildings that we have if we carve that out. The second bill, where there's the increase in 2.75%, and I guess it's good, it's better to be good or lucky than good. when your LSO staff indicated, they picked a number of 2.75. I thought they'd probably looked at the presentation material we gave them, because I think they really kind of nailed pretty close. If you want to maintain your buildings into the future and have the life expectancy that this committee and I think the legislature and the governor's office expects, you need a number up higher than that 2.75 if you're going to carve out all those other items to keep those life cycle of those buildings where they should be. The number of buildings that would be on a percentage basis that we would be having to go and do either reconstruction or a rehabilitation to on those life cycle type of years that are out there. And again, I'll go ahead and let Mr. Small kind of weigh in on that, Mr. Chairman, if that's okay, and then we'll certainly answer any questions that you might have. So,
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Beagle.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, in that vein, if you move to the 2.75%, and I get it what you're talking about, major maintenance, but we have all these earmark funds, enhancement this and all those. If we're really trying to accomplish what a lot of us want is to maintain these buildings for the full useful life, should we not be cutting back some of those other earmarks rather than adding to it to be able to have the sustainability we want for our major maintenance? And it's hard to, every school district is going to be different, but if you look at from 30,000 feet, it seems to me, if we're going to make the commitment to really take care of our buildings for the useful life, we ought to not be earmarking more money for certain other direction and let you do what you're supposed to do, which is proper maintenance for the life of the facility.
Mr. Chairman, I think over as the school commission in the program itself now with the state construction department, separate agency, as that has evolved over the last couple of decades, it's really, I think, been a learning curve. And so how do we address things? So first off, I think the safety funding, the 10%, where that actually came from a couple of bienniums ago, was that there was a request from the department to fund some additional money for safety. And because of the budget constraints 4 years ago, which I think all of you are very aware of, that wasn't there. So the committee at that point in time, the Joint Appropriations Committee said, well, why don't we just go ahead and allow them to use some of their major maintenance funds? In our budget, you'll see later this afternoon, the commission is asking in its budget request for an additional $10 million dedicated solely to safety. And last year, the legislature and the governor provided for $4.95 million, again, in direct safety funding. So, I think that would be a program that through a direct funding mechanism, that you could probably get rid of that 10% for security and fund it directly going into for the districts. And again, the other major, I think, help for the districts in that modification for safety funding was the ability for them to address any of those items that have been identified in safety and not that prioritized 1 through 8 items that were on there, because some of the districts have done all their 1 through 8 and they want to move on to the next elements in there. So, or kind of the discussion you had a little bit earlier, can we do 1 and 13 because it makes sense to bundle those together and it's cheaper to do it that way. So there was flexibility given to the districts this last year to be able to do that. And so I think that's one aspect. Now, how you would address enhancements is a different issue, because the enhancements isn't just the new enhancements. I think the way it's set up now, if you have a new enhancement, let's use Laramie High School, through their bond, within that bond, they have to have money set up in the bond for future maintenance within that bond request. So when Laramie asked for their new high school, they asked for X amount of dollars that went to the physical construction and then ongoing maintenance. But you have a lot of these older buildings prior to the Campbell rulings and prior to the commission that have facilities that are termed as enhancements, and there's no really way, they didn't have a bond at the time to cover that. So I think that was the thinking of the legislature when they carved out 10% for enhancements, is that would take care of those things that were, I guess I'd use the term, a legacy aspect to older buildings. And so given that, that would be something I think you need to look at a little bit different. Suitability, again, forgive me, but I'm kind of the one that brought up the issue of suitability because we've had a lot of requests and this, how do you move a wall or what do we do for some of those things. I think we, the department and the commission, both recognize that there's a need to move forward as we go into an asset preservation program, and the legislature providing more money for maintenance of our buildings so that our buildings will last longer. There's a need to address these suitability issues, and it will evolve over time as we change how we teach students. I mean, my daughter's a kindergarten teacher, and I can tell you the way what she does with kindergarten students now versus looking back over the years when I was in school is night and day different. What they're learning in kindergarten, I was learning in second and third grade, and how they're doing that with screens and everything else. We just didn't have that technology. And so I think it will evolve over time. So how do we address that in not only our older buildings, but some of our newer older buildings, keeping in mind that we've got buildings that the state has funded now that are 15, 18 years old in this life cycle that we consider new, redone buildings. And so how do we address that? And that's really what we've been discussing today, and there's different avenues, component projects and limiting that. Do we take a percentage of, or do we set aside a separate program for suitability? All of those things are the things that we're talking about from a policy standpoint today. So I think that when we get into Bill's discussion, it'll become pretty evident that where we need to be, and really what we're looking at is the dollars touching the building. We want to be in that 2.25 range. And so the discussions we had previously with the 2.5 takes into account that we also have to look at the parking lots, the outdoor lighting, the landscaping, the sprinkler systems, all those things that aren't the building, but they're a site improvement. And that's where that 2.5 came from.
Speaker Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, just, and so as we look at state facilities now, we've recently, in the last budget, moved them to 2%, similar to schools. But now without these other carve-outs, different missions, different buildings, obviously. But do you have a number on that? I mean, when you say only 1.6% is going in the building, and policy of that, is it a similar story in the state buildings or state facilities, or is that something you quantified, really?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that's something that we have not quantified, but I think you're probably in that same aspect where we look at site improvements, we look at drainage, we look at parking lots from time to time. Whether it's in that realm, I don't know, because we haven't assessed that in the building stuff. The accounting system where we're moving into the AIM system on the state side that we have for the school side is really, we're just getting into that. So I don't know if we could pull the records readily like we did on the school side, because we've been using a system that made it pretty easy to pull that versus paper records, because we're transitioning from all those paper records into a computerized system on the state side.
Follow up.
So just kind of same related, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Director, that so on previous presentations we've heard that 2% will give us a life expectancy on a new construction, 30 years, and then 2.5 at 50 years, or whatever those numbers.
Right.
And so maybe could we remind the committee again what we're kind of talking about on these percentages on life expectancy of buildings?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I believe that will be in
You're
Mr.
gonna
Small's
be in that, okay,
presentation.
thank
So we're going to have those same curves. There's a couple of
Yeah.
pages with those same curves. And again, I think it'll really, when Mr. Small put that together and came to us and we kind of reviewed it, it was an eye-opener and pretty graphic to me with this carve-out, with the other carve-outs, what that does to the building life expectancies. If we don't either set up a separate funding stream or we fund that within those categories, I think we're making a huge mistake.
So, Mr. Chairman, just as pay me comment, just pay me now, pay me later, really.
It is. One of the things, Mr. Chairman, that I think you'll find interesting in Mr. Small's presentation is we really, and we didn't do this in the previous one, we looked at some costs, and I'll let Mr. Small talk about those more, but we looked at the use of funds. So if we're spending this money now versus in the future, and we got with the state auditor and looked at, and treasurer, and looked at, okay, how much are we earning on interest? What's the lost opportunity cost? Things like that are in this presentation. Again, there's some pretty dramatic dollars, and we broke those out for you as to what these changes would result in future cost to the state of Wyoming. So,
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So Dale, as I look at this suitability issue, it looked, and there's probably more ways, but you could do it like safety. You could carve out a pot of money that's just for that, and then, you'd all somebody would prioritize that, and you'd use that pot of money. You could do component funding, which would put it in the mix with other component type projects, or you can do major maintenance. And so one thing that I was wondering is, and as districts get up to speak to this later, I'd be interested in their thoughts. Do most of these projects rise for suitability, rise to the level of a component funding? So those are usually bigger than major maintenance, or are they look more like major maintenance items for the most part? So I'm just curious, scale of projects, do we have a sense of what the scale of these projects look like for the most part?
yes, Mr. Chairman. Touring literally hundreds of schools, talking to superintendents and their facility managers over the last 4 years since I've got into this role, it's across the board. So you're going to have the one issue that I saw with component is that, and it can be managed, and I'll give you an idea. I was thinking about it when I was sitting here on how you could do that, but my worry with just component projects only is you're going to be looking at those big items. And so if a school needs an air conditioning system or something, and it's $4 million or $17 million or whatever, that's going to be up here. So how does I just need the wall moved compete? I don't think it will in a component project. Now it could. I mean, the districts could throw that all in, and when I was at YDOT, we kind of had a similar system there. I mean, YDOT has hundreds of buildings, and as when we'd look at the budgets as chief engineer and I'd go through, there was certain years I would have just, I had X amount of dollars, and I'd say, I'm going to do this building modification, this wash bay, this thing over here, and these are $300,000, $400,000, $800,000 each, and I'll do those, and I can only do 4 of those a year. And then the next year I'd come in and say, okay, because I hit some of these big issues, this next year when I'd look at the budget with the district engineers, I'd say, okay, we're gonna hit all these small items. So now the next year I might have 50 items, but they're from $4,000 to $50,000, and use that money that way. You could maybe structure the component project, but if we looked solely at those that would kind of rise to the top, I'm guessing a lot of those would be bigger projects. If you look at the component projects that you do see coming before you that we'll talk about later today in the budget, there is a mix. There's some smaller ones, but there's some $4 or $5 million projects in there also. They're not necessarily at the top, and I think that's the beauty of the system that we have, where we have the districts reviewing all of those processes, and the districts helping us rank that. And I think the model works very well. I think that's, if we want a suitability component project, we should use that same model. We've refined it over the years, and I think it would work that way. But I think there needs to be, whether it's just a smaller dollar pot to address moving a wall, painting. There was a question, what's the difference between major maintenance and routine maintenance? That is a fuzzy line, and it's always moving, and it will always move. If you draw the line at this, I can guarantee you the next month I'll get some requests on, well, it's just almost sort of there. And so, how you look at that, we try to follow as best we can the statute. And so let's look at painting. Painting a classroom or a hallway in a building, I would say, would be routine maintenance. Painting the hallways or the classrooms because it's 10 years or 15 years out and you have this, that would be major maintenance. The same thing with carpet. If you had some it was in a kindergarten room, something happened, and you got to come in and replace that carpet in that room, one room or 2 rooms in a building, that's routine maintenance. But if you're replacing the hallway all the way through, and that falls more under major maintenance, and that's how we look at that. And so it's a give and take with the districts. It's the discussion process. But again, over time, we've kind of evolved into here's an understanding with the districts what typically happens, but we do get requests from time to time to hit those other issues.
Senator Rothfuss, Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back though to the kind of educational suitability and trading off if we have a fixed number of dollars with major maintenance, I think about the example that we've used since we've been in this room so many times about the educational suitability of this room. If we want to put $100,000 every year into a sinking fund to fix the roof, that's obviously a good investment. But if we're preserving an unsuitable space, whereas if the first year we just put
Right.
2 more walls in, had 3 classrooms, but we were down $100,000 in terms of our sinking fund for the roof, in that instance, you just look at the facts and you think, all right, educational mission is better served by putting the 2 walls in. So somehow we need to end up in a situation where the reality of the circumstances on the ground, the sanity of the circumstance ends up prevailing instead of just, well, it doesn't fall under the rule set, I'm sorry, you can't use your funds that way. So I certainly understand it, and you've heard no bigger advocate to raise this number to ensure that we're using our funds prudently in the future and we're not just saddling liability onto the future generations.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we need a system that ends up ensuring that the first step you take is to turn this into 3 rooms. Is there more we can do to go down that path? Are we going in the right direction with this legislation? And again, I understand the sensitivity of the trade-offs that we're going to hear in the presentation, but do you see a better way to do that?
Mr. Chairman, couldn't agree more with Senator Rothfuss. And again, that's through my tours in the school. I mean, I've been in schools where I totally agree with the superintendent. I totally agree with the principal and the teacher in that room that you either need to add a wall or take a wall out, and that will evolve over time even with the number of students in that area. But we're following what state statute says, and I don't have the opportunity to do that. And again, Shelby Carlson, who was the former administrator for the department, and I kicked this around for well over a year, talking with districts and trying to figure out, how can we tackle this issue. And that's, again, I apologize, but that's why I brought it to you all. I think it's really a policy statement for the state. And the reason is the commission does have in its rules and regs, brought the thing here on how you assess buildings for suitability. There's 171 items in here that we look at under the current rules and regs on suitability. What's the classroom makeup? What's the size? Illumination? It breaks it down into all those areas. The problem is when the department tried to use that almost a decade ago, that it was just really unworkable because how do you measure that became the issue. There was lots of terminology in there. How close is the nurse's station to the administration offices or whatever, but it didn't say 100 feet, 50. So how do you measure it? When we hire Mr. Small to come do the assessment to say is the building suitable or not, there were so many subjective terms in there that to try and go back and do that, it wasn't workable. And in fact, this committee said, this isn't working, so let's worry about capacity and condition. And so the suitability aspect wasn't taken into account. So now we've come to a point, funding-wise, where things have slowed down. We're trying to maintain buildings. So to your point, we need to have a suitable space in a new building or an old building to deliver the educational program. And I think we've got within this presentation a little bit later, we'll let Mr. Small do his first, but we did ask the districts what they see is important to them, and we did go out and reach out to 3 different consultants that do this type of work nationwide, and what's their definition. And within that, then our reviews, I think how we tie suitability to the delivery of the educational program is the key. because I think you're going to have a difference in how a teacher looks at it, a principal looks at it, and a superintendent all within the same district. But it's how are you delivering that program? Not necessarily how big my room is. We have those standards already. We need a certain size room. But how do you configure things to meet that program that the state says needs to be delivered? And so, again, I couldn't agree more. And maybe it's a mix of two. You have a component that you look at these bigger items, because there are a number of districts that don't have air conditioning. They need some major lighting upgrades, things like that. But you still need somehow to address moving the wall, doing some painting in a shorter area. Maybe you go into some of the older schools that we all went to school in. They're pretty much brick or block walls, and they didn't have the ability to hang things up on the walls like you see in all the newer schools. So how would you address something like that? And I think that's more small dollars. And I truly believe that should be up to the superintendent and the principal. Is there a pot of money that each district can use to address those items, because they're the educators? I think I've told you folks before, I'm an engineer. Much of my staff are architects. We're not educators. We can look at the building. We can determine, Mr. Small can determine, do we have adequate lighting? What's the ventilation? Those sort of things that we're already measuring in the FCNI score, not the FCI. But that appropriateness of the student, or the appropriateness of the student environment language in the statute, is the reason we're here today, and that's what we struggle with. And how do we measure that in the future? And to me, to some degree, that's an individual superintendent working with his staff to determine what's the best way to deliver the educational basket that the state says they need to deliver.
Mr. Chairman, just in that appropriateness of the student environment is not only in statute, it's statute mirrors really
Supreme Court.
Supreme Court.
Yes.
That's the key, I think, so.
Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two questions for Director McOmie. The first one, and I apologize if you've already covered that, but if we bring that up another 0.75%, is that funding that we already have in place, or would that be an impact to the model, and based on square footage, what would that impact be?
Mm-hmm.
And then my second question is, you referred back to the ability to statutorily to divert those 10% for safety, 10% for enhancements. You referred to that mainly going to bricks and mortar, but remind me, I have in my head that safety was open-ended. It could be anything with safety. Does that just have to be bricks and mortar, or could that be personnel as well?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that's more of a brick and mortar. Yep.
And then on the first question, Mr. Chairman?
We can get, Mr. Chairman, off the top of my head, I don't have those numbers, but we can certainly get that while we're doing the presentation for you. Okay, Mr. Chairman, with that, if we're ready, I'll
Please
have
proceed,
Mr.
Director.
Small. Mr. Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Bill Small from Facility Engineering Associates. I've been asked to look at the impact of the 20% major maintenance spending out of for suitability. So that is what I'm focusing on, is just what that impact is. So I will, I have a presentation up, and
Also in your smaller of your.
I'll call out slide numbers as I go, so hopefully if you're flipping, that's correct. If you're flipping through what's in your packet, then you can keep up that way. So going on to slide number 2, this is just the big pie. This is the big major maintenance pie. 100% of major maintenance goes into a bucket, and we're going to talk about where that goes from here and what the impact of those decisions are. So when we looked at this on slide 3 in 2016, we looked at the behavior of major maintenance spending and essentially kind of carved it up into two kind of major areas. What went to the building and what went outside the building. And in doing that, when we went through that analysis, about 20% of major maintenance payments, if you will, and therefore spending, went outside the building. So that is where the 1.6% of CRV that you've heard comes from. If you take 20% of 2%, that's 0.4% of CRV. subtract that from the 2%, like 1.6% of CRV going to the building. So that was historically what we saw. We looked at that again through payments made as far as we could get into 2019, and the behavior has not changed. So that has continued. So 20% going outside the building.
Senator Beebe.
Yeah, excuse me, Mr. Chairman. CRV, you got two engineers that can't figure it out. So what is it?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Bebout, that is current replacement value. So CRV is the current replacement value of each building, or the total across the state is the sum of all your building replacement values across the state.
And Mr. Chairman, that's something that's updated, not regularly, but over a period of time to come up with that CRV, correct?
Mr. Chairman, we look at that every year.
Every year.
Yes. Yeah.
Please proceed.
On to slide 4. In slide 4, what we did is we looked at essentially the carve-outs that we've seen or have been talked about. So again, if you look at that big piece of pie, 20% has been going to outside of the building. Then there's been a 10% allowance to go towards security, and a further 20% being considered for suitability. So if you take that big pie, we've now sliced half of it out and said you can use it for these other things. So our analysis looked at the impact of that collection, of which part of that is that 20% for suitability.
Representative Larson.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Small. Help me understand on that building, on that chart there where you have the 20%, where is, or that 50% taken out of the total pie, where is that 20% non-building? How does that impact that?
So again, taking that big piece of pie, the historic spending has been 20% of the spending going outside the building. That's the orange piece of the pie.
Oh, there it is. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I see it. Thank you. I apologize.
Senator Beebe.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And what's that used for primarily? What is that? Outside the building? You're not talking about the exterior of the building. You're talking about the grounds, grass, cut the grass, parking lots. What is it?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Bebout, it's not the ongoing maintenance such as cutting the grass. It would be for site-related repairs and replacements, parking lots, sidewalks, drainage issues, those kinds of expenditures. It would be major maintenance expenditures, not going toward, if you will, landscape maintenance, that kind of thing. Those are going to be under your sort of routine maintenance or O&M spending.
Proceed.
On to slide 5. This is something that we had looked at and developed back in 2016, and this is what looks at the effect of various levels of spending on essentially your replacement rate of buildings. So this will go back to some earlier questions and comments regarding the impact of spending. So the yellow in the middle is 2% of CRV. That's what's intended by statute now, is 2% of CRV being funded for major maintenance. As you look at these carve-outs, we look at different effects of what the carve-outs mean. If you look at the spending habits, if you will, that's what took us to the 1.6% of CRV, and that is the line just above that. That kind of looks at, again, as you spend in these different behaviors, what effectively happens is you're reducing the major maintenance money available to the building. So now the 2% is not fully available to the building anymore. We're sending 20% of it outside the building. So as you do that, you are essentially, effectively, getting 1.6% to the building, and therefore you will end up replacing buildings sooner as you do that over time. As you carve out an additional amount So now we're at 1% of CRV. If we have those other carve-outs, you will have less money, again, available to the building. So effectively 1% of CRV, half of what was intended by statute originally, 1% of CRV now available to maintain those buildings from a major maintenance perspective. When that happens, essentially, if you look at those charts, what that basically tells me is as you look at each of those curves, the percent of buildings that would need to be replaced over a given period of time, depending on the funding level. And it gets pretty dramatic as you step away from 2%. You can see some sharp rises in percent of buildings needing to be replaced at a point in time as you go away from that 2% number. In 2016, we were also asked to do an analysis of what would be the sort of optimum level, if you will. That was where the analysis took us to the 2.25%. So we've kept that curve in here as sort of a baseline for what was talked about in 2016 is an effective spending of 2.25% of CRV going to the buildings. That would give you your long-term best return on investment, if you will, if you were at a level of 2.25% of CRV. Again, that's not considering any carve-outs. That's all effectively going to the building. So as you carve out that money away, you are essentially putting yourselves in a position where buildings will need to be replaced sooner. The more you carve out, the more buildings need to be replaced faster, and over time that will result in a significant sort of change in sort of your investment statement, if you will. So if we, oops, I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, just so that I make sure that I have this right, another way to look at this graph and state what you just stated is that if you look at the 2.0 replacement value, am I reading correctly or stating it correctly to say that 60% of our buildings will have to be replaced over the next 50 years?
Correct.
So that's another way to look at it, right? And if we're at 1.6, then literally 90% of our buildings aren't going to make it past 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Lander, that is correct, and I want to make sure that everyone understands that when you do an analysis like this, you have to make certain assumptions about what does replacement mean, when does replacement happen. So the way this analysis was done was by looking at the Facility Condition Index, FCI, over time. So as you spend money on your buildings, condition will improve or not improve depending on what you're spending and when. So depending on certain funding levels, your conditions will fluctuate over time depending on what the needs are at that time and what you've spent up until that time. So what we looked at was a Facility Condition Index, FCI, of 0.65 as the trigger for replacement. And there's some argument in the industry to suggest that that's a reasonable place to look at and begin to decide whether replacement or renovation or something like that is your most cost-effective remedy. But that was the sort of stake in the ground that we put. So there's going to be major capital investment required at that point, whatever the flavor of that investment is.
Senator Representative Larson.
Same question.
Okay. Senator Bebout.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Different question. What about, I don't see enhancements up here that I thought about, unless they're, but the 20% non-building might be enhancements, so I don't see that. So where enhancements? The other thing is, where are we now if we change nothing? Is that the 2.0, but how do these affect the different things, whether we carve out without enhancements, with enhancements, without suitability, with suitability, and there's no cross reference there?
Mr. Chairman, so I will get to the second part of that as I advance through to the other slides.
So tell me about enhancements then, Mr.
So
Chairman.
enhancements are considered. The way we looked at the analysis was that spending on enhancements was going to the benefit of the building, so we did not carve that out separately. If you carve that out separately and say that's not impacting the base of the building that you want it to impact, then you'd be carving out an additional 10% out of that pie, if you will. But we've looked at this over time, and what was not easy to pull out of the data was the historic spending on enhancements. We couldn't pull that out of the data, so I couldn't validate that one way or the other. So I don't know the spending habits. I would prefer to know the spending habit to tell you whether or not there's a major impact of that 10% spending for enhancements. I don't know.
Please proceed.
So if we go to slide 6, there are a couple of slides here, this and the next, that are similar data, just presented in a different fashion. The first slide here is essentially looking at where we are today. So the baseline, those bars that are zeros, are based on 1.6% of CRV. That's the baseline. Okay? And each set of bars is a chunk of bars at 25 years, 50 years, 75 years. So the first 3 bars are 25 years, the second 3 bars are 50 years out, the third 3 bars are 75 years out. If we look at the carve-outs, if you will, that's the additional cost, if you will, to carve out additional spending, and that would be the negative. So $510 million over 25 years, $810 million over 50 years, $900 million over 75 years. Those are the negative bars. So relative to where you are today, that's the additional cost to you of carving out those those carve-outs, if you will. Okay? And the blue bars going positive are essentially the savings if you were to fund at the desired state of 2.25%. Okay? So over time, although you're spending more, effectively you're saving by not replacing as many buildings over a period of time. So over 25 years, if you replace fewer buildings by maintaining them at a higher level, you would save $1.1 billion over 25 years, $2 billion over 50 years, $2.4 billion over 75 years off the baseline today.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Summers.
Chairman, thank you. So ultimately, you'd have to compare that to increasing costs of construction, past costs of construction. So there'd have to be some analysis as to whether you're actually saving money based upon rising construction costs.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, we did inflate the costs by a rate of inflation that was 3.71%, and that's based on historic data provided by Bureau of Labor Statistics. They have a specific set of data for school construction, so we went back over a period of time and annualized that, used that as the construction inflation value. So all of these have been inflated forward and then discounted back, so that every one of these is a present value calculation based on that inflation and discounting. The discounting came from state data that we used the discount rate provided to us. That's provided in the last slide what those values are and those assumptions are.
Senator Cost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, if I'm reading right correctly, the 1.6 shows 0% gain or loss in every case. So that means we're not losing money with the 1.6. We're not gaining it either. We're holding steady. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cost, that was intended to illustrate relative to today. Relative to today. So relative to today, that's not that would not be considered the ideal spending level. That would be the 2.25%. Okay. but that is about where you are today, is that again, 1.6 is going to the building, 20% is going somewhere else. Okay.
So, Mr. Chairman.
James Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So, just to go back a slide, basically that 1.6, which was the baseline, would mean every 25 years we're going to replace over 50% of our schools. So that's the underlying assumption of the next slide. And if we didn't want something like that, then all of it would change. You'd have
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Rothfuss?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing that's not totally clear on the slide on page 7 is the concept that your current replacement value means that you could build a new school if you had the CRV handy, so to speak, right? If today I have a new school, the CRV. So that's why you get an eventual trade-off where it doesn't make sense to invest more, even though that 3% CRV line is low. I've invested a full additional percent for enough years that I would literally have built a new school. Does that make sense? So it doesn't show that counterintuitive trade-off, but that's the reason why it doesn't keep getting better, is that eventually I've just got enough money that it makes more sense to build a brand new school next door. So just to clarify that.
Sure.
I don't know if that is kind of what Representative Summers was just getting at or not. But
Director McOmie?
Mr. Chairman, along that lines in our discussion over the last couple years, that was one of the policy decisions that I think this group made, was that do we try to make our schools last 75 years, so how many dollars do we put into that? But if they're 75 years, does the suitability issue, if we're building a new school to last 75 days or 75 years today, are we going to even 75 years from now, would we even have kids in school? Or is it going to be all electronic? So how long do you want to make a building last? We could, in our presentation previously, we can make a school last forever. But are we going to need a school forever? And so what's that trade-off? And that was that optimization that we talked about with the 2.25.
And Mr. Chairman, follow up on that. The report that, when you did that report 2 years ago for the optimization, I think there was a lot of good additional information, which I don't think we circulated it recently to everyone on this committee. It might be good just to send that report out again in case there are members of the committee that haven't seen that, because it really was interesting to see how you marched through and arrived at the optimization based on a lot of different scenarios. And if everyone here hasn't seen that, I think they should, to see how we got to this concept of 2.25%, the assumptions that were handy there. So maybe our staff can just circulate that, or if you have any updated content that goes along with it, it would be handy to see. This is the product of it, but I think the process that we're working is really valuable, Mr. Chairman.
Speaker Harsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If we could go back to slide 6, just a question I had. Earlier on the 10% or the 20% for security, 10% of the 22, 10% for security. It seems like 4 years ago when we put that in there, obviously there was major security concerns like we now have all the time. But when you looked at the fixes, some of those security requests, they seem to almost all be on the building, right? And
Yes.
so when you talk about these, you're taking that whole 10% and saying it doesn't go to the building. But I remember the number one thing, I was on appropriations then, it was door locks. That was the number one thing. And then cameras and all these other things. But so I guess my point is, you know where that money, where it's being spent. And I think to say all 10% of it's just like parking lots and sidewalks, I don't think that's, I don't like that. I think we're missing something there, because I think it's almost all going on the building.
Mr. Chairman, you're correct. It's going on the building, but we're not looking at it as an improvement to the components of the building per se. If you look, for example, at door locks, that's more of a routine maintenance issue than changing out, all the door locks. So a lot of it's going to cameras. Some of it's going to the vestibules, which in some cases is an addition to the building. But it's not something that we look at, is that going to keep the building up and maintained and running, the addition of a vestibule? And that's why we've carved that out separately. But you are 100% correct that almost all that money has gone to buildings. Now, there's been purchases of radios and things like that for buses and communication systems, but handheld walkie-talkies, things like that. But a lot of that, yes, has gone to those buildings.
How much of that 10% has really, has it all been used every year pretty much for security?
Mr. Chairman, no, Mr. Chairman, it's really varied by district. We can get you an accounting of that, but it really varies by district. There's some districts that were very aggressive on the front end and spent their portion of that original $9 million and wanted to do more, and so they matched on that. You had other districts that were waiting to do some larger projects, and so they didn't have enough out of their original 9, and that gave them the ability to take that money, pair that together, and then move forward with some larger projects. And so it's really, it's just, you got 48 different scenarios for that, but it certainly, I think, has been beneficial for the districts. So.
Do you mind if I comment on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Harshman, also the carve out in the pie there, if you will, the 10% is a relatively new thing for security. So we don't exactly know what what's going to happen. But one of the things that you might think about is if for security purposes only, you address door locks, that may not be in line with what is needed from a condition standpoint. So the off-cycle spending that you may do on security may have nothing to do with the condition of the building, so therefore it may be spending that has really nothing to do with advancing the life of the building. So that was why it was assumed that spending in the future may not impact the preservation of the building the way that other major maintenance spending does. Time will tell, but this is relatively new. So the same would go with the suitability. A 20% carve out for suitability, the expectation there is that it will do less to impact the sort of life and longevity of the building, and more to do with what it requires to deliver the educational program, and that may have nothing to do with the condition of the other systems in the building, and therefore not preserve or extend life of those components of the building.
But it might.
But it might.
Air quality.
Yeah.
Almost.
Further questions? Please proceed.
Thank you.
So I believe the next slide we were going to look at is slide 7. And some of you may have, and that would be your page 9 in your packet. The slide there is essentially showing if the baseline that we look at now is after the carve-outs. So all the carve-outs being considered, what happens at different levels of additional investment to the life of the building, and therefore your again sort of present value proposition if you look at spending over time. So again, these are chunked in 25 years, so 25 years, 50 years, 75 years. So each set of bars is a 25-year increment. So over the first 25 years, if you bump that effective funding back up to the 1.6 where you are today, bump it back up. So you are, if you look at the baseline as 1% of CRV, because we've carved out 1%, right? So now if you bump back up to 1.6, that would be a savings over 25 years of $510 million, $810 million at 50 years, and so on. If you bump that up to 2.25% effective, which would be 2.25 effective. So you've taken 1% away, so now you're talking about 3.25%, not 2.25% anymore, because you've taken away that 1%. So to get to a 2.25% of spending on major maintenance would actually be a leap from where you are today up to 3.25%. Okay, so getting to an effective 2.25% was what was considered your ideal state. That was the optimization study done back in 2016. So you just got to keep that in the back of your minds that we're looking at an effective spending level. So after carve-outs. So if that makes sense. Now you can always go back to those curves and kind of look at what happens kind of in between. So if we were to do that and step back to those curves, you could kind of interpolate between them, estimate between them at different levels of funding to say what would happen in terms of different funding level with regard to the replacement rate of the buildings. It would at least give you some sense of the impact if you go back and kind of look at different funding levels, whether on those curves or in between those curves. And just the last slide is your page 10, is just the list of assumptions that we went through. One thing that I have not stated yet, but I want to make sure that you do consider is, if you look at a building lasting 50 years or 75 years, most people are going to say, well, it's not that I don't do anything on those buildings. There are things that I'm going to do over time that are perhaps in addition to major maintenance. Perhaps there's a renovation that happens. So we assumed renovation at 25 years. Every 25 years there would be some level of money going into the building that could address a number of things, including suitability. So that was a baseline assumption that we made. So that was done at 25-year intervals. There would be some amount of money going into the building as a capital expense to do some level of renovation or something like that. We used a 3.71% for inflation, and again, a discount rate of 5.2% to bring back to a present value. So everything done here was inflated and then discounted. So the analysis was all done as a present value analysis to give you a real idea of how to compare one option to another.
Representative Summers.
Sure. So is the 3.1%, is that an inflation rate of government construction, construction of government buildings, construction of all buildings in the United States, or how is that parsed out?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, that is the data that is maintained by the Bureau of Labor Statistics to represent construction across the country. It is not federal construction only, not at all.
Yeah.
Okay, please proceed.
That was all I had in my presentation today. And if there are any other questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I'm ready to turn it over.
Any further questions for Mr. Small? Any questions? Okay, seeing none, thank you, Mr. Small. I think we'll take about a 5-minute break. Director McOmie,
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, before we take the break, much appreciated, by the way. I do have an answer for Representative Larson. If we were to move to the 2.75, we're currently at, that would be an increase of $57,375,000 a biennium. So our current budget is at $153 million. Add that to it, we'd be at $210 million a biennium.
$50 million, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, $50 million for biennium.
Yeah, 57 would be the increase. Yeah, 57,375,000. And again, our budget request this year is 153, so that would move the total request with that addition to 210 million for the biennium. And interestingly enough, that's about where we thought we would be from the study before when we were looking at those dollar values. I think we were in that 211, 212 million dollar range. So.
thank you for that, Director. Any questions on that? Travis,
So I look at your budget book and I see 148
Mm-hmm.
for major maintenance, so.
Mr. Chairman, we'll address that later on. There's actually, looking at the new CRVs and the way the statute is set up for us to look at CRVs moving forward, we pay 75% for the first, then we adjust that we pay out the last 25%. There was there was a change in statute on how we pay that out, and then the next biennium, or the next year of the biennium, we look at that. Looking at the numbers right now, we really, and we'll talk about that later, we need about $4 million more than what we have in there to meet the biennium request.
Further questions? Okay, we'll take about a 5-minute break. And then Director, I think you have a little more on the suitability
Yes.
presentation and the committee will
Yep.
discuss our bills.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
continue our educational suitability discussion, and I think the director has more information he'd like to provide us. And continue on. So Director McOmie,
Okay.
please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Del McOmie, Director for State Construction Department. The other thing that we were asked at the last committee meeting was to try and look at what's definitions out there for suitability or educational suitability in that overall realm. And then also reach out to our stakeholders, the districts, and get some feedback from them on that same issue. So we did that in both of those cases. And so with me today I have Mr. Brandon Finney. Brandon is our administrator for School Facilities Division, and I'll let Brandon proceed with that. So,
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Brandon, SFD administrator. So one of the tasks was to reach out to some consultants and talk about the definition of educational suitability. Through developing the budget and working with some consultants, I've been closely in contact with 3 consultants, MGT Consulting Group, Amoresco, and FEA, which is a consultant that was just here earlier. All 3 of these firms do provide the services of defining and working with entities of doing educational suitability. I won't actually read each one of them, but in theory, or in concept, a lot of the definitions that each firm provided, they had similar concepts. Some of them was the ability of the facility to support the educational environment. They all talked a little bit about spaces, which currently we do have capacity calculations and those things within the school facilities methodologies. They also talked a little bit about site in each of the definitions. So they had some similar themes and concepts throughout. And we can go into any of those in further detail if you'd wish.
Mr. Finney, what was the group that worked with Laramie One a couple of years ago? Is it one of these groups, or is it a different group that they had come in?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Landon, MGT Consulting Group was the firm that did actually work here in Laramie One. When I talked to these companies, a lot of them, Wyoming's a little bit unique. We look at everything as a global, as a statewide perspective. Usually what they would do is they'd come in and they'd look at individual districts because it's usually handled in states at a local level. They had to identify the needs and help target a program specific to them. We're trying to take ours up a little bit, obviously about 30,000 feet, and look at it statewide. But this firm has done work here in the state.
Thank you.
Further questions? Okay, Director, please proceed.
why don't you just go ahead?
Okay. Mr. Chairman, the next item that we talked about or was requested is just to go ahead and reach out to our internal stakeholders, which is the school districts, and get a take on what they thought of educational suitability. So we did a survey. The process there is we sent it out to the superintendents. We wrote them a little letter. We had 11 of 48, or approximately 33% of them respond, as you can see on page 14. First thing on page 15 that we went through is prioritizing each of the criteria that's identified in the statute. As you can see, in highest priority was the appropriateness of the student environment at 81.8%. The second highest was air quality at 45%. Third, technology readiness, and then fourth, illumination. On the air quality, section 3, we had them rank that stuff in priority, and ability to ventilate was 54%, and that's currently what we're looking at when we go in, supplies and returns of air. The second was adequate ventilation, and the third was essentially adequate as well. So
Testing the particulates.
yep, and testing of the particulates. So go through and check out all the different types of systems. We also had some other responses. Replacing coal fire boilers with natural gas, I thought that was unique because there's several districts over the past couple bienniums that have actually had to come forward. The supply just in coal wasn't even there, so they had to ask the commission for funds or use funds to address that situation.
Senator Landon.
So, Vinnie, those coal-fired boilers, any sense of how many we still have out there?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Lannon, not exactly. I do know of a couple that have been replaced. In Sheridan 3, they replaced one. I know Campbell, they went through and did some changes there. I think Sheridan 2's even done some. So they're organically getting replaced. So on illumination, the highest priority is natural light and tied with adequate amount of light. So in the current condition assessments, they do look at the candle footprint of how much light's coming into the building. The second, they have also the two same categories, also adjusting the brightness of it. And on the third highest, essentially adjusting the brightness of the light. So a lot of the lights nowadays, you know, are dimmers. They can go up and down. Some of the classrooms you go in, they put over the draperies over the light, but now it's getting a little more sophisticated with technology that can control the amount of light coming into a room.
Representative Green.
So I understand dimming and writing different classrooms. Does that also mean that you have different lighting zones to where that you can have one zone in the classroom that's bright so the kids can see, and then a dimmer one where you have screens and that kind of stuff, or is that totally different than what you've asked in your survey?
Mr. Chairman, I do know some of the classes do have that ability, especially when you get into the high needs or special ed classrooms. They do have some of those functionalities. A lot of the newer stuff that is putting in the solar lights and natural daylight coming in within the facility.
Mr. Chairman, we did ask, the orange was the ability to adjust the brightness within the classroom. So again, that was the third highest priority within the districts. But when we've toured some of the newer schools, the technology, primarily due to LED lighting, is really changing what's there. And they'll actually have 4 different sets of lighting that they can do. And some of that comes down to certain types of light are better for test taking versus, again, dimming down so you can see the screen, those sort of things. And a lot of the newer classrooms have the ability to adjust to those different aspects of how that room is actually being used. Obviously, our older buildings, you just don't see that so much yet.
Mr. Chairman, moving on to Section 5, Technology Readiness. The highest priority, I found this a little unique. So power was almost a given, as you know, 9.1%, but ability to connect to the internet and internet speed was pretty much tied, which in my mind said, hey, we need internet, we need it fast. Second highest priority was ability to connect, and then on the third was the power, be able to get the supply.
Representative Larson.
Thank you, Brandon. What's your opinion on that first priority on those two? We shouldn't have any, do we have a problem with power or internet? I think we put a real emphasis on that.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I do think there's some areas in the state, and I think there's even a note that does have some slower speeds. So adequacy of internet speeds, it's right there, the very first one. Some districts do have that challenge, and with today's learning environment, it's important to have that connectivity in a timely manner.
Well, Mr. Chairman, is there a geographic area that's, or is that kind of scattered around the states, those districts that are slow?
Mr. Chairman, through you, Representative Larson, we don't know, or I don't know specifically if it's a regional issue, a supply. We'd have to do some more investigation on what causes that and in what areas.
Thank you.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, that was pretty much my question, except if you could later on send me, I'd like to know who's efficient with the speeds. Just give me a kind of a breakdown of that.
Mr. Chairman, that was who is efficient with it?
Who is deficient?
Deficient. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Schools that are
With broadband,
Yeah.
whether it be their facility or their provider is providing that piece of the network.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, some of the schools that I've toured that I think are that I heard from staff that were in that way. Some of those are your more remote country type of schools. There might be 3 or 4 students, but it's 50, 60 miles down a dirt road to get out there, and there just isn't the connectivity like you'd have along the main routes within the state. But we'll check into that and see what we can find out for you.
Please proceed.
Section 6 is the appropriateness of the student environment. As you can see, it was broken down by 7 different categories. Building security was the first at 54%, and delivered state required educational program at 45%. As you can see going through there, the results varied depending on the colors and the different priorities. Some of the common notes was cafeteria and dining. I think we heard that a little bit earlier about, is that appropriate? Vestibules and common areas. And be able to provide the best experience for the children. Spaces to be utilized appropriately, having them in a safe and comfortable environment. So those are some of the open questions, responses to this.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So the number 2 priority, capability to deliver the state required educational program. Did that get broke down into what that really is?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summer, it didn't go into the actual requirements and then how their building breaks down by each element. It didn't get that granular.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Bebout.
Yeah, along that same line, that's so subjective. The capability to deliver the required, it could be any one of all the others. It's just very subjective.
Please proceed.
Section 7 was just an opportunity to allow the districts to represent open comments on definitions, and went through there, and they sort of have a whole variety of responses. The first page, page 20 of 26, is essentially specific responses. Page 21 was a district was in agreement with what MGT provided as a consultant. And then we had a question for response number 11 is, what type of projects would you undertake if you were able to address educational suitability? And you can see continuous security, update LED, HVAC upgrades, make accommodation to classrooms. So there's quite a few different options there in what districts need or would like to do.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So on the one thing I don't understand is, so HVAC goes bad. Well, let's say you don't have an HVAC. I would assume that could be a component because isn't that so where does HVAC, is HVAC really this suitability, or is it, I thought HVAC was like a standard item, so I didn't understand that.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if you have HVAC in your building, that falls under major maintenance and you can replace that. If you do not have HVAC in your building, then you can't add HVAC under major maintenance. Now, we have allowed, however, and I think this was an earlier question when we were talking about upgrades. We have allowed districts to come in and add HVAC when they were doing something to their heating system, because what you find is in the new systems, particularly the multi-rooftop type of systems, it's actually almost as cheap to add HVAC, because that's typically what the industry does now. You order it with heat and cooling rather than just ordering it with heat. And literally it's been within a few $1,000s, $10,000 difference on a building to be able to upgrade or add that HVAC when you could do that. There's other times where you're working off a big boiler system and you don't have those rooftop models and things like that. That could be in the case of Campbell when we've been up and looked at their schools. That's tens of millions of dollars to do an HVAC upgrade for that facility that they're looking there. So the dollars vary, but when, if they can come in and show us that it's, really apples and apples when we're talking costs, we're allowing that to happen.
Further questions? I think that wraps up their presentation from the department on suitability and suitability research they have done after our last meeting. Anything further you guys, the two of you would like to add?
No, Mr. Chairman, just welcome any questions that you may have as, you work the bill or however you want to do that, so.
Very good. Okay, committee. So back to where we started on a couple pieces of draft legislation, discuss suitability and have different ways to address it. We do have a meeting October 28th, I believe it is, so we don't have to take a final vote on this legislation today. We can walk through each of these bills page by page for we do some public comment right now. So public comment.
Mr. Chairman, I'm Rick Woodford, Commissioner with the School Facilities Commission, and I just want to discuss a little bit on suitability. I appreciate the study from Mr. Small and the numbers, but I think there's a human element here that this committee needs to consider. And the human element is that districts, local districts, and the humans in the districts still make decisions about how major maintenance funds are going to be spent in order for asset preservation. Those decisions are made at the local level, and one of the things that I've seen as I've gone around the state and I've been in buildings, in fact, I was just recently in a building in Rock Springs, and the commission toured the building, and it was, the bones were in good shape. Solid foundation, good walls. I mean, it was a sturdy, nice building, but of course, they want to tear that building down, and it's been mothballed. So the question is, well, why? And as you took a closer look at the building, you could see that they hadn't spent a lot of major maintenance in a lot of years on that building. And I'll tell you why. Because that building, for many years, has not been suitable to meet the educational needs of kids. And so the decisions that are made at the local level, in many ways, take in consideration the suitability of a building. Because the primary purpose of every building is to educate kids, right? We wouldn't educate them in a warehouse even if it was in excellent condition. And the only way right now in Wyoming to address suitability issues is to build a new building or to renovate. Those are the only ways to address it. So I question how many very buildings that are actually could be in good condition over the last 20 years we've torn down because of the local decisions that are made about how we utilize our resources to maintain those buildings. So I think that human factor has to be considered. That's why suitability is so important, because at the local level, when we see that a building is no longer suitable to educate our kids and we're backed in a corner because we have no way to address those suitability issues, now we're faced with the decision. Are we going to continue to spend our major maintenance dollars to maintain this facility? Or are we going to let some things go? And again, it's not a question of ethics, because everybody's ethics are in the right place as far as we need to educate kids in a suitable facility. You can't question the ethics. So systemically, we have a problem in Wyoming. We are not addressing suitability issues. You need to give local districts some control and some way financially to make sure that buildings are suitable to educate kids. And if you do that, I think those projections and those numbers, if you consider that human factor, I think they would be much different than what we saw today. Thank you.
Questions for Mr. Wood?
Any questions? Yeah.
Senator Roth,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is something that we've been talking about for a while, but it's kind of a challenge to get to it. And it's the idea that we have all of these different pots of money that aren't fungible. So you get a certain amount as a district, which get a different pool which can be spent in a certain way. So the districts aren't allowed to optimize, and as a result, we haven't seen any optimization for, all right, well, we can keep this school open 20 more years if we spend money in this way, or we can shut it down early, and there's no analysis of that from the district standpoint. So what do you see, based on your testimony, you know, what steps can we take to make it so that the districts have more choice and more say, so that they're optimizing all of their resources instead of just here's a funding stream, here's a funding stream, here's a funding stream? Have you given thought to what policies can be changed?
Yeah, and I think I'm one that has brought up this idea that you know, we need to give districts some flexibility in how we use those major maintenance dollars. And I understand the dilemma here and the purpose of that money being asset preservation. But again, unless there's a motivation by local districts to preserve an asset, they're not going to. And if we're going to preserve an asset, we have to have the flexibility to make sure it's suitable for the purpose that building exists. And you know, technology has changed, times have changed. It's really hard to educate a kid today in a building that was designed 50 years ago, because what was suitable 50 years ago is clearly not suitable today for education. So we just need that flexibility.
Representative Larson.
Thank you. So is it your opinion that the definition of suitability is the same across the state?
Probably not.
And follow up, Mr. Chairman. So that what I think you see us struggling with today is how to define that to where we don't see a use of that, abuse is probably not the right word to use. I don't know what word to use, but to make sure that appropriate use of those funds for suitabilities issues is appropriate, because I think there is some discrepancy in how that's interpreted, and we're trying to figure that out. Do you think we're running down the wrong trail and trying to give some guidance on what suitability is?
I do. Respectfully, I do think we're going down the wrong trail, because what's important is that what's suitable in Lovell, Wyoming is going to help us have the motivation to continue to preserve our facilities and to find those facilities in the condition that we can educate kids best. In Cokeville, Wyoming, they may have maybe a slightly different need there. In Gillette, probably something a little bit different. But what's important is that they have the flexibility to make those buildings suitable according to what they think is suitable. And we're talking about the people, the teachers, we're talking about the principals, superintendents, facilities folks that are employed there. They know what needs to be suitable in their district. Even the school facilities commission, if you leave it to us, how are we supposed to know what's suitable in all these different areas around? And certainly you guys can't do that either. It's the trained professional working with kids under their circumstances. That's where the flexibility. Trying to define it to me is, and you know, we can define it today, and in 3 years from now that definition can change. So let the trained experts decide what's suitable. And you limit it. You're worried about money running away from us. You limit it by that percentage. That's what limits it. You limit it by the percentage.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So, okay, I understand there. But what's your philosophy on the security? So right now, 10% major maintenance versus, we have a pot of money for security, and we use that rather than allowing the erosion of major maintenance to go to security. And then my second piece with that would be enhancements. Going forward, should we really be using major maintenance money out of this pot of money for future enhancements, or should that be built into the project level?
Well, those are good questions. I see security and suitability. They're very similar, the issues that we're talking about here. And that's the other thing that wasn't represented in those numbers is we don't always use 10% of our money for security. We have the flexibility to use 10%, but oftentimes, many years, we may only use 5%, or some years we may not use any. right? And if we have projects that we're planning for asset preservation, then we may funnel that money to those needs. Those are local decisions. And so that system right now seems to work pretty well. We can use it for security if we need to. And I see suitability the same way. We're not going to always use that 20% for suitability, but in the need that the need arises, we have the flexibility to funnel that money that direction. Otherwise, we're using it for asset preservation. And I would argue that asset preservation and suitability are very much intertwined. It's hard to really separate those things out. And so when you're spending money for suitability, many times, it may be insulation or windows to make a room more, easily moderate the temperature, whatever it might be. Sometimes those things are one and the same. Okay? And as far as enhancements, no, I don't personally think that major maintenance should be used for enhancements. That's just my personal opinion.
Consider cost.
Thank you, Chairman. In the idea of flexibility and allowing flexibility for sustainability, as different principles move in, different philosophies move in as well, how do we put some kind of a constraint on that so that the open philosophy to the closed door philosophy to all of that doesn't totally change everything within 4 or 5 years to where all of a sudden now, well, we're not going to put a lot of money into it because this principle doesn't like it, and then the next principle ends one to something else. And you and I both seen those changes.
And we're talking about suitability here. Well, I think that's a good question, but are we going to run into any more obstacles with that problem than we are with defining it and having it change on us? I would say no. I mean, I think there's a trade-off there.
Follow up.
Do you think there's a way to put some outside parameters on it so that it's not going too far to the left or too far to the right, so that we've got some kind of a control on that within reason, so that there's still plenty of flexibility to the district, but yet at the same time, we're not allowing it to totally get out of hand either way?
There probably is. I would say that there probably is, but we just have to be careful because if we try to define that, we're just taking that flexibility away from districts to be able to make decisions about what's best for their kids. And I think we have to have some faith in the fact that we have local school boards that are overseeing all of this as well. So it's not just a runaway train. We have elected officials that are monitoring everything that we're talking about here. So the question has to be, does there have to be state control over everything? Like I said, you got control over the percentage. Do we need it beyond that? I would say not, but.
Speaker Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in regards to this bill draft, this point 4 on defining suitability, and so as Commissioner, I mean, you think that's not a problem in your eyes, and you think this is a good bill, and 20% flexibility.
I think it's a great thing.
Yeah, and so my question then, moving forward, then, I think the definition is going to be important. I think also the rating is going to be important. We've struggled with this for 20 years. We've combined them, then we separate some. We couldn't define suitability. We're going to have to kind of work on suitability. And as you said, locals know it. You see it when you're in that situation. So my question, 2 questions on these percentages. Maybe the 20%, is that the right number? Maybe it's higher.
Well,
it's more. And your thoughts on that? I mean, as far as flexibility, some years your district might spend 0, some years it might need to spend 30% to fix an elementary room to make it a more suitable 2 classrooms. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a good question, and it's interesting you ask, because I do think that one option we could look at is having suitability as an overarching category with security within it. So, you have 20% and then 10% of that security funding actually falls within that 20%. So we're talking about 20% total instead of 20 plus the 10. I don't know. I don't know that 20% is the right way, but and the other thing is I really believe that a lot of the suitability issues are smaller issues. I do. I think in a lot of cases they're things that you can do for maybe 20 grand and under. And so obviously to make that like a component request would be a bureaucracy nightmare for the commission and for everybody else involved. So I'm against having the commission have to approve every little thing that goes out for suitability. I don't think that's the right way to go. I think it's that flexibility and yeah, I don't know if the number's right.
Okay, and then my next question, you said 10% on enhancements. I think the thing though, that when we think enhancements, everybody thinks pools. That's the first thing comes to mind. But really, a lot of this is, as the director talked about, legacy, and a lot of it's legacy square footage. Frankly, so over your school level, that might be bigger if might be a smaller roof if we built a brand new level high school today, right, or whatever. And so I think that's part of the preservation of the building. I think people got to realize that. So just gentle comment on that. I think it's more than just quote pools or whatever. So a lot of it's legacy square footage.
Sure. Yeah.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to the flexibility, it sounds like what you're advocating for is that if we provide more flexibility, that there will be local responsibility and they'll put it to the best use, which is something that I agree with. But one of the challenges we've had with the flexibility is that flexibility in major maintenance, there's still going to be a big wall where there's components that are entirely independent, and that's assuming that we fund components, right? A lot of years we just cross components completely off the list. And then new buildings. So there's no fungibility of funds from the major maintenance side, and there's really no incentive necessarily to keep up all of your buildings. It's almost like, and it certainly used to be more like this when we had more money, this triage concept of we'll maintain these buildings and we'll let these ones erode a little bit in hopes that we'll move up the list on the new buildings list, right, to get a new building. And at some point you kind of have to do that. What if we had more fungibility? What if we actually had, this might work better for our larger districts than our smaller districts, but what if we had all of these funds coming out where you got a certain distribution as a larger district, certain number of dollars per student per year, and the district actually had the ability to plan school facilities for the entire district where they are competing components versus buildings versus maintenance, so that you had the true cost competition in place instead of the artificial one that we incentivized. From your perspective, would that be more effective? Would it be more effective in some districts and less effective in others? What are your thoughts on an even more open approach?
Well, I think this might sound kind of silly, but right now with the component system that we have, we're really creating an inequity in Wyoming, because there's the districts that you know, they get it, and other districts that don't even apply for it. So having local flexibility and having the resources we need to take care of our facilities, I think if everyone had the opportunity to make those decisions locally, then I think that provides more equity in my mind, because you can address the issues that you need to address as a local district. Now what you're talking about is a whole retrofit of the system. What we're talking about here is a tweak, just a minor tweak to make it work.
Well, Mr. Chairman,
Follow up.
it is a retrofit of the system, but this is a system, I've been on this committee for 10 years or something like that, and the system has never worked the way we want it to work. The incentives are not aligned appropriately. We know that everyone in this room just wants to educate their kids. That's the objective. I've never seen anyone operate outside of that objective since I've been on this committee. But because of the way we've structured statutes, we get strange outcomes from a financial standpoint because they want to educate their kids. We don't let them go directly to that, so they start doing things in a way that it's not really what we're hoping for. You've been engaged where you're seeing this up close. I mean, is there something that we should do to fundamentally change the system? Should we get rid of the component and take all of those funds and put them in major maintenance? Should we have more confluence of funding between major maintenance, new builds, refurbishment, legislative swish away from being from being a new system. If we need to move to a new system so that we can more appropriately and effectively spend these dollars. What are your thoughts?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not advocating to get rid of component level funding. I think that there's definitely a need for that right now in the state. But I do understand what you're saying, and I don't have the answer to that. I mean, I think we're all living in the system that we're in right now, and we're trying to make it better. I'm here to testify about the one gap or deficiency that I see, and that is with addressing suitability issues. And what I want to see is I want to see schools, and I want to see them renovated after 30 or 40 years. And I just hate to see schools that are closed down and let's tear them down because they're not suitable to educate kids. We just need to address the suitability issues. So,
Mr. Chairman, one more follow-up. Sorry to continue on this, but from a policy standpoint, I understand your objectives, but I want to make sure that the statutes align with those motivations. And if you tell me strictly to selfishly optimize as a district, and I've got a large number of schools and you're underfunding, in my view, major maintenance, I'm going to fully fund major maintenance on a few of my schools so they're preserved, and I'm going to let the other ones erode. And that, to me, based on the resources I have, is a true optimization. I'm doing what's in the best interest of the students, because the buildings that erode, I'll replace them. The buildings that I maintained are going to be in great shape. That's probably my optimum, but that's the statutory optimum, but it doesn't seem like it's the educational optimum. So is there something we can change? You're up here advocating for trying to get this aligned better, and you're the one who sits on the commission that oversees it. Statutorily, what are we doing wrong that has these motivations out of sync with one another?
Well, I think I've already stated that is we're not addressing suitability. If you can address suitability adequately as a district, why would you let any building erode? There'd be no motivation to do that. If you can address the suitability issues so you can adequately educate kids in that facility, that's the missing piece, in my opinion. That's the missing piece. That needs to be addressed. I think it needs to be addressed immediately.
So adding the 20% and making sure it's sufficiently funded, those are sufficient to achieve the objective?
I think along with component level funding, because we do address a lot of suitability issues with component requests. They're addressed right now. But you have to, again, there's a rigorous process to make that happen and make that work for districts.
Thank you.
Senator Bebout.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm getting conflicting testimony from you. On one hand, you said you don't like the direction we're going. I understand the suitability issue. So are you saying you'd rather not have the 20%? Because like one of the suggestions is that you'd have 17 different components to evaluate suitability. So we're going to throw that on you as well. What I'm hearing you saying is we probably don't need that 20%. We just need to figure out a way that local control will take care of it because they understand it. Which way is it?
No, I'm not saying we don't need the 20%. I'd love to have the 20%.
Earmarked out of it, specific for that?
Yeah, the question was, is 20% the right number? I don't have the answer to that. I don't know. But I think it's a great starting point.
Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm just going to ask something a little bit differently. Thank you for all the time you're giving. This is a great dialogue, and appreciate you being here and being willing to put up with all these questions. I'm a little bit misunderstanding of what do we do with these suitability projects, and if you lived in an ideal world, how would they come to the commission? How do we have some idea that the commission has some oversight as to what these suitability projects are that are going on out there, and that you deem them appropriate? Because that's the accountability piece that I think a lot of us feel pretty strongly about. So, ideal world, how do the suitability projects rise to the level and compete with component projects and have a chance in front of the commission?
Yeah, I think that's
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I don't know if I have the answers to that. what I'm saying about component level is that some of the requests that come across as component level, they're addressing suitability issues along with the, whether it's asset preservation or whatever it might be. They're not right now. They're not standalone suitability because we don't address that. But I don't know the answer to that question. I just think that there probably does need to be some means to be able to address suitability. The 20% I think would address most of what is out there.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate that. I think what we're all kind of trying to drill down and get arms around is maybe those projects that are falling through the cracks at this point. And maybe that's not the best way to put it, but there are projects that simply can't get up there and compete with an HVAC system
That's
or
true.
a brand new roof or whatever it is. And unfortunately, at the state level, we've got a finite pot of money that it's up to the commission and this select committee to put our heads together and the department to say, this is what we think we can do this year. What started this conversation was the department, along with some of us on this committee, going out to the districts and discovering that there's things that we should be considering doing, but we can't. And so I'm just curious how we can get those projects to you on the commission in a proper way. And maybe it is underneath this 20% or whatever. I'm with you. I think the districts know, but how do we fund these suitability projects? That's the tough part.
Sure. And Mr. Chairman, I think the 20% is a starting point. I didn't come up here to testify about the component level requests. In fact, I tried to get out of this seat just as quickly as I could after I testified. But so I'm sorry, I'm not prepared to answer all of those questions. But the 20% is a starting point. That helps us a lot.
Thank you.
Okay.
Representative Freeman.
Thank you. I think that one of the questions that has to be answered is how do you incentivize districts to do the suitability upgrades for the buildings that we have? Because I taught in the Rock Springs School District for a long time. I know what building you're talking about. My wife went to kindergarten to I think 6th grade there. She was very upset when they said that they're going to tear it down. But the whole focus as they were building schools around there is that we're going to put all this suitability stuff, we're going to make this a great school so that we don't have to use that building again and that it becomes obsolete. So how do you incentivize people to put together effective educational space? I agree with you that I think that most of these projects are very small. I think about my wife's classroom that I showed up with drills and all this other kind of stuff to make things better. And my classroom could have been easily handled with $2,000 to $5,000 worth of labor to make it go forward. But how does that? You have to put a roof on. You have to put a new boiler on. You have to do that other stuff. But if you're going to really preserve everything, you have to do the other small classroom projects along the way. Any clue or any idea of how to incentivize school districts to do that kind of stuff?
Well, it's interesting. We're talking about incentivizing something that we don't even fund right now.
Exactly.
So we have to start there. We've got to provide a means for districts to take care of suitability issues. Once that's done, I think you'll see that you don't really need to incentivize it. The district's hands are tied right now in a big way. And it's costing us millions of dollars, tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, in my opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's the answer I was looking for.
Mr. Woodford, thank you very much. I certainly appreciate all of it. Sorry to put you on the hot seat there.
That's okay. Yeah.
Any further public comment?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'm Janine Bayteski, and yes, I am an elected official from Teton County. With me is Jeff Doherty. He's our assistant superintendent. I just wanted to sort of go a little bit further than what Rick did as he was talking about this whole thing on suitability. As you know, from the last time we were together with you, we talked about the needs in Teton County where our bubbles are moving up to the secondary level at the middle school and the high school. At the high school, they've been able to deal with it by, I would say, and you know, keep in mind that most of the suitability I'm talking about is capacity driven. It's student driven. So at the high school, what they've been doing is doing things like tearing out lockers and creating learning spaces where lockers were. Minor tweaks that we can contain within our budget, and we've moved forward with it. At the middle school, we had some options. As you know, you all funded a Mercer study for us. One of those options was, well, let's just build another pod, a 6th grade pod, to deal with the capacity. That's expensive. So what we've chosen to do is, as I would call it, take care of our learning challenges at the middle school, which are like teaching music in the hallway, the fact that we've got middle schoolers who, as you all know, are rather rambunctious, who are bumping into each other in the hallway. So eliminate some of the pinch points in the hallways and clean up our violation of the fire marshal rules with the number of children in our cafeteria at lunchtime by doing some minor tweaks. And we've come to you for $2.5 million versus dealing with the total capacity issue, which would have cost us many, many more $1 million. So I just want you to know that we really take this funding seriously. We really understand the state of the state right now and the lack of funding available. And you know, offering us the ability to fix our learning challenges this way, we really appreciate as we're moving forward. I think Jeff provided an interesting definition to suitability as he was surveyed by the department. And it really gets to, you know, how do you resolve the challenges that we're faced with some of the constraints? Do you want to add something to that?
No, and of course we worked with other school districts in providing that definition. I think it gets to Senator Bebout's concern that he wants something more quantitative than qualitative. And, you know, I think it's important to, Mr. Woodford pointed out that you have good people at the local level, but we also have an aspiration to do the right thing. You know, we take care of our facilities. I'm not aware of districts that are allowing themselves to run buildings down. At the end of the day, it's important that we maintain credibility with this body. And if we were to play shenanigans in that way, it would come back to haunt us in future ways that we wouldn't appreciate. So we try to maximize what we do with these dollars. I like the fact that it's a little more binary, the way that we're trying to define suitability. With the request that Trustee Teskey just touched on, we tried to stay away from suitability because that would put us into a defined process with an undefined term. So we have brought our request. You'll see that it doesn't have a perfect fit, but the department, I think it's a good example. I think we didn't have a perfect fit, and we were able to work with department staff and explain our conundrum to them, and then again with the commission, and I think the process works. So I'll leave it at that, Mr. Chair.
You can kind of look at it like a Venn diagram where you've got, you know, capacity, you've got component, and all of these things, and there's this sort of overlap that happens, which is to Jeff's point, is it gets a little bit unclear when this overlap happens. So I thank you.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And this goes to that, you know, the piece of the pie. It's the same question I asked the last gentleman. You know, on enhancements going forward, I'm not talking about enhancements in the past because we kind of already made that deal. We're going to do major maintenance on it. But on enhancements going forward, should that be a part of the major maintenance puzzle, or should that be provided when the project is developed? So I asked, what's your thoughts on that?
Mr. Chair, Representative Summers, I don't know. I know that when we did our last major enhancement, which was when we built Davy Jackson Elementary School, the gymnasium fell outside of the purview. You know, it was, we wanted a gym versus just a common space. So we actually, at that point in time, that was what drove us to set up a recreation district. And that recreation district created $300,000 as a set aside for the major maintenance on that gymnasium. So I don't know moving forward.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Landon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just real quickly, Superintendent, you brought up something that I thought was an interesting comment. You said the process worked. And a couple of the projects that the trustees described to us were what would probably fall underneath suitability. Yet the process worked. And so I guess my question is, how do you feel about this bill if we set aside 20%? And do you really need that? Or do you think districts can work the system now and come up through the department? Probably, I'll be interested to see what you have. Do you have projects out there that would fall underneath the 20% that you just simply have never been able to bring to the department level? Is that the conundrum? Or?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Senator Landon, we do. Part of, you'll notice our request, not to ruin the ending for your meeting today, part of our request is to ask the state to help us fund some capacity enhancements, but we're also doing some that we have to fund internally, just because major maintenance isn't available for those, and we've just got to, as a district, dip into our funds and our resources in order to achieve some of the suitability problems that we face. The 20% is as Mr. Woodford stated, I think a good place to start. We don't request suitability component level projects. We try to manage our budget, but we have the benefit, like our friends in Laramie too. It's a struggle for them to be able to rely solely on major maintenance. For us, we just try to plan projects. Anyway, hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. Why don't you request component projects? This is something I've struggled with over the years, particularly when we were flush with money. It was like a separate pot of money. And these projects, we just handed them out. So you get your major maintenance money entirely funded, and then you've put in for a component project, and we hand you $1 million just outside of the rest of the budget process. Why don't you apply for that? And I know other districts don't. I don't mean to be picking on you, but you just said that, and I've struggled to understand. I can see it if you're a tiny little district, because then you just don't have the human power to actually fill the paperwork out to apply for the component. I get that. Why don't you apply for the component project?
Mr. Chair, Senator Rothfuss, the reason we usually don't is because it's, A, we try to plan for our projects, and B, we have a superintendent who usually wants things done yesterday. So we don't have the 2 years that it takes to go through the component process for most of our projects.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. Further public comment?
It is still good morning. Kim Nelson, Laramie 2, and I'd just like to speak in support of Mr. Woodford's comments. I think he hit the nail on the head. If you don't include suitability in your life expectancy, you have to expect that the life will drop. It's been something that's been missing for years and years and years. Many of you were on the committee when our district came forward and asked to have Pine Bluffs Elementary replaced, because our condition was such that it would never have been replaced. We were very consistent in keeping our buildings in good condition. But that building was so poor suitability-wise that we couldn't see going forward. So we had no option but to come forward and ask for it to be replaced. I think this is a huge step in the right direction. I would encourage you not to go overboard in trying to define suitability. I think that varies so much from district to district. I think you've got good checks and balances in place, because the districts every year have to come forward to the department with a facility plan that has to be approved. That facility plan has to include how they are going to address all condition scores of 1s and 2s. We are obligated to either fix those things or explain why we can't do that. So that's a check and balance. If we get If we have a disagreement with the department, we can go to the commission. If we have a disagreement with the commission, we come to the select committee. There are checks and balances. It can keep going forward. I don't think you want to go overboard trying to overdefine suitability, because I think you will then really constrict the ability of districts to deal with that. And I think that's a huge component of what we need to have done. The presentation that showed that the major maintenance is going to be sucked away if you allow these percentages to be included in major maintenance, I think that's a very alarmist view. It's a maximum amount that we can spend on those different components. I don't think you will ever see any district take the full 10% of security and the full 20% of suitability and the full 10% of enhancements and use that year to year to year. It's not going to happen. What happens is funding or the use of that matches the available funding. There hasn't been any funding for suitability. I think you will see a dramatic increase this first couple of years in people wanting to address their suitability issues. And you might get a little alarmed, but I think you'll see that slack off. Very much as you saw a lot of school districts jump forward and use 10% of security when that was first offered. But as you have funded new security components this year, I think you'll see that drop dramatically. I wouldn't use my major maintenance for that if I've got other funding available. And we have got new funding available for security, so I think you'll see that drop off dramatically. So I don't want you to get over concerned with these huge percentages that are being allowed and think that that's going to happen every year, because I don't think it will. I think the districts are far more cognizant of their ability to be able to keep their buildings up, to maintain their buildings. We're all in the same boat. We want to keep buildings going for as long as we possibly can.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you. Well, along those lines, we had a brief discussion, I think last time as we were discussing this bill about an aggregate concept. If we were at 2.5%, for example, through this legislation, and you basically said, up to 10% for this, up to 20% for this, up to 20% for this, not to exceed an aggregate total of 0.25. In other words, you've got 2.25 still going to major maintenance, and up to a quarter point can be used in any of these categories. Is that something that would still achieve your objectives, but maybe provide the committee and the department with a little more comfort that no, in fact, nobody's going to use the same year 10% for security, 20% for educational suitability, 20% off grounds, all of those kinds of things? What are your thoughts on that type of approach in aggregate?
Chairman and Senator Rothfuss, I don't see that as necessary. I really don't. I think the very first stopgap is the department, and they have to approve each and every project. And if they see you going overboard, they're going to say, look, you haven't done this over here yet. This was on your facility plan. Before you go there, you need to go here. And I think you see that, and I think they're very diligent in that. I think most of the school districts will be very diligent. Will you have an outrider who might come in with some crazy project? Possibly. I think they'll get shut down. I think the process is there to make sure that there's enough oversight. I think if you start putting definitive restrictions, you're going to again get away from our ability to deal with suitability on a district by district basis.
Thank you.
Very good one.
Senator Bebout.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You make a very compelling argument about the suitability. It's hard for me to vision that, but I get what you're saying. The question I have is, if we start earmarking and tell you to do things differently rather than what you want to do locally, you should make that decision anyway. And I think you would do that. How can us telling you up to 20% going to help you make that decision when you're already doing it and you recognize that fact anyway? And it's like saying, okay, here's $1 million. If you don't spend it on this because we think you should, then we're going to take it away from you. That's not the way to do local control. I just see you doing what you're doing anyway, and how does this help you do something differently?
Senator Bebout, I think the way I'm reading this bill, the way it's set up, you're allowed to expend up to that amount should you choose. You're not obligated to spend 20% on suitability. You're allowed to carry, if you don't have a suitability project that you can afford this year, you're allowed to carry that forward to next year so that you can build up that fund. Funding this definition is what will allow us to finally address suitability. We haven't been able to before because there was no funding available. Suitability was kind of out there. They were going to address it as they built new buildings. But on a district level, we had no means of addressing suitability because it was not specific to replacement of an existing component. And I think one of the things you'll see is air conditioning is a big thing. As our buildings are used more and more year-round, air conditioning is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. I'm not a global warming person, but I can't deny that over the years, it does seem like temperatures have gotten warmer. Air conditioning is a big deal. Right now, we can't put air conditioning in. We can't address air conditioning if you don't already have air conditioning. Most of your 30-year-old buildings don't have air conditioning. That's a suitability issue that we would be able to address under this bill because it's an allowed thing. I mean, it's not a direct replacement of something that's there. That's been what's been constricting us in the past.
The last part, Mr. Chairman, is are enhancements part of suitability?
I'm with Mr. Woodford on that. I think enhancements are misunderstood as being people out there building pools. Legacy square foot, I think, is a lot larger portion of enhancement. In my district, that's the case. I have a very small school that was built always knowing that the other portion of that school was going to be there. When they built the new portion, they built classrooms only. They didn't put in an art room. They didn't put in a music room. They didn't put in offices for special conditions, like for speech pathology. We can't do without that building just because of the way it was built, but it exceeds our square footage. Therefore, it has become an enhancement. I think you see that. I really do think that's a lot larger portion of enhancement than swimming pools. You only see the swimming pools in the big 4A districts. Us little guys, we don't have that stuff. We're not wasting our money on that kind of enhancement. I shouldn't say wasting. We're not spending our money on that type of enhancement. We're not there.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, so I'll ask you the same question. So going forward on enhancements, okay, we've made that deal and behind, but going forward, any new enhancement, should that be part of major maintenance or should that be up to the district to create a sinking fund or some other mechanism to maintain those buildings? I'm not talking about the legacy stuff. I'm talking about future stuff.
Representative Summers, I struggle with that a bit. As a very small district, I don't know that we would ever be able to fund that outside. For example, one enhancement our district has are lanes 7 and 8 on a track at a high school. When we built that track, that school was on the verge of becoming 3A. We didn't feel like we could have a 6-lane track. It wouldn't make sense. That school has since become a 3A. I can guarantee I'm coming back and asking for that enhancement to be removed off of our ledger because a 3A school does qualify for 8 lanes. That's the kind of thing, though, I feel like that does deserve to be upkept with that 10% set aside of major maintenance. I think in general, most schools are being conservative and being reasonable in the use of that funds, and I don't see that as being necessary to be outside of that 10% allowance.
Okay, very good. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Further public comment?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you. Dave Bartlett, Laramie 1. Just a couple things. To start with, we did used to have the ability to address suitability, but it was done from the needs list. Then you came up to the remedy phase. We sat down with the commission, the department, and we talked about what's the appropriate remedy. Do we knock a school down? Do we do an addition? Do we renovate? Do we combine? So there was a whole lot of internal workings with your district's long-range plan to determine what was the best outcome. One of the first things that I had the opportunity to do when I got into this role was 2007. I did serve on a committee that was going to address this thing called suitability. We actually started with a definition which was a facility's ability to either augment or detract from instruction. So when I look back to the definitions that you were given from the three firms today, I think that's very similar, and it's the ability to deliver, the basket of goods. I think one of the things we have to realize is if you've had a facility replaced or addressed in the last 15 years, I think you're going to have very little to question about suitability, because we've got a set of design guidelines, we've got a set of adequacy standards, and everything we've done has been along to meet that. So the question of 20% moving forward, I think that you could address adequacy or suitability issues of a majority of your modern buildings moving forward in that fashion. Population shift, you may have changes in curriculum, but those things can be handled because of the way the design guidelines have been developed to support our current day practices. The concern I have is when you look at we looked at slide number 8 in the show in the slideshow that said we should be doing a renovation at 25 to 30 years of the half-life, and we've done a lot of facility analyses, and that's come up with our third-party folks as well, that somewhere along the line you've got to, at the half-life, go in and address boilers, air handlers, all of those things that do eventually wear out. And in the meantime, when you do that, that's the opportunity to come through and address suitability. We've done that on several projects. We just finished Buffalo Ridge a year ago, which was about a $4.5 million renovation. We were able to add fire suppression, air conditioning, technology. We addressed all those things. So I think the issue is when you look at a district like Laramie 1, we've got 35 schools. They range from 75, 80 years old up to about 18 months old. And so the suitability amongst all those suitability can be very different. So I would go back to earlier talking about how much money should we spend on suitability, and I think it still comes back to the first thing. We've got to have a definition of what it is we're spending money on. Obviously we had MGT come through. They did do a suitability study on our district, and it was very definable. They were scores, and I think you could use that same type of methodology as we do with major maintenance. Right now we have an FCI score that every building's addressed, and how do you folks in the commission ask us to spend our major maintenance money? Address the 1s and 2s first. So if you come up with a definable thing, you assess the buildings. Again, you would expect the districts to do the 1s and 2s first. If you've got a condition that's changed in suitability, I think you've got the exception language that we could go to the commission and ask for that. So I think some of that's in place. But I do still think we have to look at, there's got to be something that's different than component level funding that allows us to go in and do that half-life renovation. To put air conditioning in McCormick Junior High, for instance, that's a 1970s building. It's about $3.5 million. To put in fire suppression is another $500,000. But when we've talked to architects to do a full half-life renovation, it's about $20 million. But I don't have a place to go to find a way to do that to prolong the life and get into that asset preservation mindset. So personally, with a district of 35 schools, to be able to go through and score and have a mechanism that says this is what is suitable, what needs to be addressed, what isn't, and I can combine that with condition and capacity. For us, speaking of optimization, that gives me the ability to say these 2 old schools that are wore out, we can take them down and perhaps combine them and do one. That reduces maintenance, operation, and staffing. This one over here, we may be able to just simply go and renovate and bring it up to its half-life. This one over here, because we've had a development, we may do a renovation and an addition. So we need that flexibility just because of the growth and because of the size of the district we are. So thank you.
Senator Lane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dave, thank you for today. I'm just curious, going back to what Senator Bebout said a few minutes ago, why would you want us to constrict you in the way we define suitability? It seems to me like everything you've said leans toward your ability to address your district the way you need to address it. You know what's suitable and what's not. You don't really need me to tell me what suitable is. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Maybe you could help me with that.
Mr. Senator, or Mr. Chair, Senator Lannon, what I would tell you is this. With my newer buildings, you're right, I do believe we can go through and we can address suitability as we see fit. I have 12 schools in the top 20 on the needs index, ranging from 50 to 75, that the FCI score is high. They're not overcrowded. But in order to put any money into them, for instance, Buffalo Ridge, that was half of our major maintenance money for the entire district for 1 year. So we can address the small stuff ourselves, but then again, do I forego 2 roofs or 3 roofs to go through and address some of these? And with Laramie 1, I guess what I would tell you is it's kind of a longer, it's a long range plan. We have 6 schools that are small, that for maintenance and operation staffing is about double of what it would be for a new school. So we're also looking at that, how do we get all of our dollars to go further? But to have that definition and guideline, I think for you folks as a legislature and for the commission, I think it at least kind of keeps us in the middle. I know I've talked to several of you who said you're afraid that it's going to go this way. So to just give us a little guideline of the railing to stay in between.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just to comment on what you think, thanks for that answer. I'm concerned that we would just end up constricting again, and then we'd be back here in a couple of years saying, well, we forgot, we didn't really define it broadly enough, and so we have districts that still don't have enough flexibility to handle some of these projects that just don't rise to a level that you feel comfortable going to Mr. McOmie and his staff to present, because you know they just simply won't make it to the top. And I think that's our desire, is to try to get down to a level where we can help superintendents and you guys that handle facilities to address problems that can really make a school better.
Mr. Chair, Senator Lennon, I greatly appreciate that, and I agree with you. If you were to go back and look at the old Rule 20, which talked about prioritization of projects, if there were a methodology that combined condition, capacity, and suitability to elevate that big project, but there were flexibility within the system for the districts to address one of the 3 components quickly and efficiently that was smaller, I think that's the balance that you're speaking of. Don't have the answer, but.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So on that particular issue, when I go back and I read the stuff on the court decision, it really talked about rating. I mean, the reason we have ratings really comes out of the court decision, I think, so we can have some proof that we're actually looking at schools and rating them and then solving those problems. And so it seems to me like we almost have to do that if we assume that this is part of what our obligation is, that we need to have the ability to rate whether we kind of like it or not. Do you have a sense of that or a feel for that?
Mr. Chair, Representative Summers, I would agree. I would think of it in this terms. In terms of maintaining a building, we have routine maintenance items that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, whether it's general fund and quickly, and then we have major maintenance items that we use that money for. So again, I think with ed suitability, is there a way to do the routine ed suitability things and then the major projects elevate? Obviously, we're probably unique with just 25 elementaries. I have some that probably hit all 3 categories. What our desire would be is to hit those that hit multiple categories first, to get them off the list and get moving.
Thank you for
Thank
being
you.
here today. Further public comment.
Good morning, chairmen, members of the committee. Is this on? It's green.
Push it again. Now it is.
Now it's really green. And now I'm on it. My name is Tammy Johnson. I'm the Government Relations Director for Wyoming Education Association, and I'm here just to speak to you on accountability, suitability, and what that means to the teachers in the classrooms around the state. I know you're aware of the Supreme Court ruling and that suitability is part of those decisions. But I want to just have you stop for a second and think about the room that you're sitting in. And if we were to shut off the air conditioning and dim the lights, and maybe that projector doesn't work. And that's what teachers deal with every day in their classrooms in this state, in some areas. When I taught at Laramie High, I loved to use the internet, I loved to use video, I loved to use audio to engage kids in critical thinking. I was a high school English teacher, and there's very few ways to engage kids in the Iliad unless you're using some kind of technology and some kind of, connected learning. And every day I showed up and had to set up my projector and rewire it and run the things that cover the cords, which aren't in this room. It's a violation. You couldn't do that in a school. And set that up. And every day the custodian came in and dismantled it so that they could clean. So what that meant was when I arrived in the morning and there were kids waiting for me to help them, I got to choose between helping the kids or setting up, getting ready for my lesson. And I think we're doing better. We're getting away from that because the schools are getting rewired. They have good projectors, but it's still happening. So when we talk about suitability and we think about how to define it, I think we should also think about what we know it's not. So my classroom was unsuitable for the lessons I wanted to give, and I knew that walking in every day. Sometimes I arrived earlier if I could to make sure I had that set up. But we know what is not suitable. And if we start there and we look at the studies that have already been done and we look at the buildings around the state where we know they have some suitability issues, where they can't deliver the basket of goods, then I think we can begin to shape, and as other people have testified, what's suitable and what the needs are by district. So I think we're going to struggle with a clear definition. And I don't know, I'm sure you didn't want the Supreme Court to tell you what suitability was, and they didn't on purpose so that we could define it as we needed to. And so I think we need to be careful that we don't define it too tightly and that it's useful for our students. And I think the other thing we need to think about as when the Supreme Court named suitability, they were focusing on an equity issue, that all kids across the state receive the same education. And that's a fundamental right. It's in Article 1 of our Constitution. So when we talk about suitability and making sure that kids all receive the basket of goods, whether they live in Laramie or Sundance, as the Supreme Court ruling says, we have to think about what suitability is for. And it's so we can deliver that basket of goods equitably, so every kid gets an opportunity. If you were to look at some of the schools across the state, even in Laramie 1, look at them right now and say, which school would I want my child or my grandchild to go to? I don't think you'd pick the schools where it's 90 degrees in the classroom. I think you'd pick the schools that have the space, that have the technology, that have everything that they need. You certainly wouldn't pick a school that is relying on modulars to educate its kids. And we'll get to modulars in a second. Capping this at a 20% share of the major maintenance is creating an inequity. Because what if that's not enough? What if that's not enough to cover one school district's needs and another it's plenty? So when we say you can use 20% and that's it, the kids who are in that district have to wait for an equitable education. And time marches on, and those kids graduate, and then more kids come in, and they're not receiving what we have determined, what you guys have determined is an equitable education. So I think time is of the essence here as well. So that's why I just think we need to move more quickly on this. When we talk about safety and security, safety was determined by the Supreme Court to be part of suitability. And we've talked a lot about door locks, we've talked about vestibules, we've talked about windows, we've talked about all those things. But we also need to talk about safety in terms of space in the building. If you were to go to Laramie Junior High, or I guess it's Laramie Middle School now, when the bell rings, that is some of the most unsafe space that you could ever hope to have kids in. The halls are crowded, teachers can't see what's happening, kids are jammed up against each other. There's all kinds of opportunities for not only bullying and harassment, but for some kind of tragic event to occur in those crowded hallways. So we need to look at safety as a broader picture for suitability, because kids can't learn in spaces that aren't safe. And that leads me to the conversation about modulars. Modulars were intended to be a temporary stopgap when schools were overcrowded. We've come to rely on those in my district, in Albany 1. as additional space, additional classroom space. I don't want my kids in a modular. I drove by those every day at the junior high, and I could see the doors propped open because they're too hot. I could see how unsafe they were. It wouldn't take anything for a tragic event to happen at one of our modulars. Those kids are sitting ducks in those buildings. And yet we continue to use that as a way to educate kids and say, well, it's just a temporary thing. It's not. We just bought a modular in Albany 1 because we know we need it forever. So those are some of the things that make our school buildings unsuitable for learning. Let's see. I agree with what's been said earlier about the 20% is not being counted as contributing to asset preservation. It does. If you are going to maintain your buildings in a way that you can use them for 50 or 60 or 70 years, you also have to maintain the suitability of those buildings. That has to change with time too, and we have to put money there. So that's a key component of asset preservation, not just whether the roof works and the lights are on, but whether you can still educate kids in that space. So that's kind of the nutshell of what I wanted to share with you. We do have a constitutional obligation. I always try to bring you back to that idea that kids have a right to this education in our state, and thankfully, I mean, it's something we're most proud of. And if you look at the recent results, we're number 6 in the nation now in what we're doing with our kids, and it's working. The plan you put together 15 years ago is giving you the results that you want. So I stand for any questions or comments you might have.
Questions?
Bam, I'm
Very
so good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for being here today.
Yep.
Public comment, further public comment. Further public comment. All right, seeing none. Committee, I think we will break for lunch, come back after lunch, and we'll work through these bills or decide what we want to do with these bills at that point, and then get on with our agenda. And try and pick up the pace for the afternoon, and let's try and shoot to be back by 1 o'clock or just a few minutes after. 1
Mr.
o'clock. Eat fast.
Is it true that today is John Freeman's birthday?
Nope.
I don't know.
Is that true?
John, Representative Freeman, is it your birthday today?
No, sir.
Just today?
Tomorrow. No, it is my birthday.
It is true.